Welcome to Method and Madness.
This is an ongoing conversation about great books hosted by writers Aaron Gwynn and Brad Kelly.
In each series, we figure out what makes a book like Moby-Dick or Blood Meridian worth reading,
and how writers might learn from it in order to master their craft.
We'll also explore the labyrinth that lies beneath the novel
and find out what it means to our most insightful friends. I leave a white and turbid wake, pale waters, paler cheeks, where'er I sail. The envious billows sidelong swell to whelm my track, let them, but first I pass. Yonder by the ever-brimming goblet's rim, the warm waves blush like wine. The gold brow plumbs the blue. The diver's sun, slow dived from noon, goes down. My soul mounts up. She wearies with her endless hill. Is then the crown too heavy I wear, this iron crown of Lombardy? Yet is it hight with many a gem? I, the wearer, see not its fair flashings, but darkly feel I wear that dazzlingly confounds. 'Tis iron that I know not gold, 'tis split too that I feel. The jagged edge galls me so, my brain seems to beat against the solid metal. Ay, steel skull mine, the sort that needs no helmer in the most brain-battering fight. Dry heat upon my brow. Oh, time was when, as the sunrise nobly spurred me, so the sunset soothed. No more. This lovely light, it lights not me. All loveliness is anguish to me, since I can ne'er enjoy. Gifted with the high perception, I lack the low enjoying power, damned most subtly and most malignantly, damned in the midst of paradise. Good night. Good night. 'Twas not so hard a task. I thought to find one stubborn at the least, but my one cogged circle fits into all their various wheels, and they revolve. Or if you will, like so many ant hills of powder, they all stand before me, and I their match. Oh, hard that to fire others the match itself needs be wasting. What I've dared, I've willed, and what I've willed, I'll do. They think me mad, Starbuck does, but I'm demoniac. I'm madness maddened. That wild madness that only calm to comprehend itself. The prophecy was that I should be dismembered, and I lost this leg. I now prophesy that I will dismember my dismemberer. Now then, be the prophet and the fulfiller both. That's more than ye great gods ever were. I laugh and hoot at ye cricket players, ye pugilists, ye deaf Burkes and blinded Bendigos. I will not say as schoolboys do to bullies, take someone of your own size, don't pommel me. No, you've knocked me down, and I am up again, but ye have run and hidden. Come forth from behind your cotton bags. I have no long gun to reach ye. Come, Ahab's compliments to ye. Come and see if you can swerve me. Swerve me? You cannot swerve me, lest you swerve yourselves. Man has ye there. Swerve me? The path to my fixed purpose is laid with iron rails, whereon my soul is grooved to run, over unsounded gorges, through the rifled hearts of mountains, under torrents' beds, unerringly I rush. Not's an obstacle, not's an angle to the iron way.
Ooh, Okay. Ahab. So, man, that's so good. That's so good. That's so rich, and what a good example. What a good excerpt to pick and read to kind of kick that off, because I feel like it's doing most of the great things that this book Moby Dick is doing.
Right.
Yeah. What is I mean, and we're gonna end up doing, I feel like, a certain amount of dissecting stuff on here. What what's going on there? I mean, I guess
Right.
plot wise and in whatever other sense.
Yeah. So just to locate uh, readers
Yeah.
in the book, for those that maybe haven't visited in a while, this is directly after the Pequod has set sail and they're on the waters, and Ahab has kind of sequestered himself. And then he makes this big appearance and nails a gold doubloon to the mast and, reveals the entire purpose of this journey. It's a whaling voyage, but we're gonna chase down this white whale that dismembered me.
Yeah, and he
And
doesn't really tell the guys until they're already out at sea that this
that's
is the
right.
plan. Yeah. Yeah.
That's right. And the crew is fired up, but Starbuck, says, it's blasphemy to take out your rage on a dumb brute. And, Ahab says, talk not to me of blasphemy, man. I'd strike the sun if it insulted me.
Right.
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 That's
Right.
the first moment where we're like, oh gosh, right. But Starbuck's the only one that pushes back in any way.
Mhm.
Um, and so the passage I read is one of Ahab's soliloquies where, he's just given this great speech. The crew is on board accepting Starbuck, and then he retires. Now, interestingly, like, and just in terms of technique and the kind of narratology of all of this, there is no way for the narrator Ishmael to know that Ahab is saying this stuff, right? I mean, if
Yeah,
it's
I kept thinking this throughout the book. This like you don't know that to
right.
Ishmael, just like you don't know that that's what they said or what happened. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of these moments of like, we talk about this in terms of narrative authority, right? How does the narrator know what he knows? And so I think there are several moments where we're not quite sure how Ishmael is getting what he's getting. And if
Mm.
it's truly a soliloquy, uh, you know, soliloquy comes from solus, which means alone, then there's no way for this to be incorporated. Regardless, I mean, Moby Dick has a number of these moments, and I'm glad that they're there. Actually, I like that there's this looseness and roughness to it. I like that there are, quote unquote mistakes.
Mm. Yeah. So do you think these are sort of? I mean, yeah, I'm glad you kind of put that in quotes. So if we take this sort of the somewhat impossibility of this being a completely faithful narrative, just from a mechanics standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, is that a mistake or is that part of something Melville is? I mean, I feel like Melville knew this. Is he trying to get away with it or is he using it?
That's
Do
a
you
great
think?
question. Oh, that's a great question. He was pretty young to have written this massively influential and groundbreaking novel.
Mhm.
And so I think he's aware of some of this stuff. I believe, if I'm not misremembering, that the first draft doesn't have the epilogue where we find out how Ishmael escapes the Pequod and the disaster, right? And
Correct. And I think there
yeah,
was even, he may have even had some feedback about that in sort of the reviews of like, well, the story doesn't make any sense because everybody's dead. So
right.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I believe that an editor said, "Hey, like the ship goes down, how is Ishmael talking to us?" Which
right.
wouldn't be the same. I don't know if it would be the same problem today because we have a number of stories where the narrator speaks from, the dead place, the place beyond life. Um, I think, The Lovely Bones does that to some degree, and
Yeah.
some other novels are narrated. And so, you see fiction writers playing around with the whole thing of narrative authority, but it made sense to Melville just to be like, oh, let me insert this epilogue, and
Right. Right.
yeah, and it totally works, right? The
Oh
epilogue
yeah.
is great, and the
Yeah.
fact that Ishmael escapes in Queequeg's coffin, right? And
He's even
Queequeg saves him yet again.
right. Right. Yeah. Perfect. A perfect bit of perfect bit of irony. I mean, but I think of as I'm reading this, thinking about this, the sort of stance of the narrator. I mean, that whole thing goes right back to the first few sentences. Call me Ishmael, not my name is Ishmael.
Right,
Right. We don't have any reason to really even think that his name is actually Ishmael.
right,
Um, and then the next sentence is some years ago, never mind how long precisely.
right, right,
I mean, there is this element where he's sort of like hinting to you that this is not going to be a true and faithful relation. You know,
yeah,
this isn't a documentary necessarily. This is a story. Uh, It has to be some aspect of it has to be true because so many of the details about whaling and history, etc., are accurate. But
right.
how much of it is this a big fish story in a
Right.
way, you know?
Yeah, I,
Um,
I think Melville is, I mean, he becomes even more interested in these ideas with something like The Confidence Man after Moby Dick, which
mm,
is even more um, subversive in the way it approaches narrative. But I think that Melville, intentionally or not, very much got in the mind of the tall tale, the stories that sailors tell at sea,
mhm.
and the material itself is kind of dictating its own form and its own rules. And it's like, oh, sailors tell these tales, some of them, stretch credulity, et cetera, et cetera.
Sure.
But this baggy monster of Moby Dick allows for this.
The baggy monster as the book itself, not the
Yes, right.
whale in this case. Yeah,
Not
yeah,
the whale. It's I forget, I think it's Henry James. I may be wrong about that, but I believe James called the novel a baggy monster to differentiate it from, the short story, which can be about as perfect as a work of art can be. I mean,
right.
you can really hone them, as many
Yeah,
writers, Hemingway especially,
right.
showed how exact it can be. But for James, the novel can allow for all of these side quests and
Mhm,
things that aren't necessarily necessary narratively. Certainly
mhm.
not in the same way that a short story, like, it really requires that every sentence, is a load bearing structure.
Right, right. And I think if you took Moby Dick and you were to strip it down to just what matters for the sake of plot, and
Right,
matters is definitely got quotation marks around it, but it would be actually a fairly short book. There's
right.
in terms of like the actual, it's pretty straightforward, really. You get on this boat,
Mm-hmm.
turns out the captain's kind of nuts and he wants to find this specific whale. You go have some interactions with the whale, finally almost get it. It wrecks your boat and kills everybody on board except one person. It's pretty,
Right.
it's kind of cut and dry plot wise,
Mm-hmm.
and what makes it, but that, in from my perspective, that book has pretty limited interest. I mean, I'm not saying it would be bad,
Right.
but it
Right.
doesn't really kind of. I don't know that we'd be talking about that book now, 100 and almost. What was it written in 18, published in 1851? So, coming up
That's
on
right.
175 years ago, I don't know that we'd be talking about it still. It would be a kind of footnote in the history of maritime literature.
Well, yeah, in the same way that Type E is.
Hmm.
even though
Yeah, nobody
Melville's
nobody
famous.
reads Type now,
Yeah,
right?
outside of a graduate class or like a Melville seminar.
Yeah.
And but those are the books. I mean, his first books that were more kind of autobiographical, yarns about the South Pacific. That was very exotic to most readers in America who had no access just to the basic information of what those islands and what life at sea looked like.
Hmm.
And so the story, as you described it, this kind of quest story is basically Jaws,
Right.
right?
Yeah,
It's right.
exactly.
These
Yeah.
guys on a boat, and they go after the monster, and they get the monster, and there's a price. And Melville clearly didn't have an interest in writing this conventional adventure yarn that the reviewers of the book in the 1850s wanted.
Hmm.
Um, he created something that doesn't have a model, or didn't
Right.
have a model at the time, and now is a model for these various more experimental books. But now when we read Moby Dick, I think that's one of the things that makes it feel so contemporary, is that it does have all of this ancillary stuff and these side quests and all the
Yeah.
cetology chapters, right?
It starts to have a bit of something, it does a lot of things that have been ascribed to postmodern literature. And
Right.
we know that all that stuff is actually all those characteristics have been already done pretty much, but it does have a lot of that. Yeah, the encyclopedic whale chapters, the side quests, this sort of narrative instability in the narrator in terms of like where the heck is he kind of and who is he and uh, but yeah, it's doing all of those stuff, and Melville was uh appropriate to the time, I guess, was sort of like rewarded or not rewarded for doing these things. I mean, this is not a book that did well in its own time.
No, it was savaged, and his
Yeah,
reputation was savaged with it. And
yeah.
instead of responding like, "Oh, I'll do something more conventional," he writes The Confidence Man, which is a friend of mine who's a professor called it the most deconstructive novel of the 19th century. I mean,
Oh man, I have to
it
read it. I
complete
have not read it.
yeah, it unravels itself like chapter by chapter, and it's all based around there's a Mississippi steamboat, and then there's a con man who is amongst the passengers, and then there becomes a question about who that con man is.
So it's there's in terms of deconstructing what it does. Are we not sure? Is he lying to the reader? Like, is there deception in it? Like, how is it deconstructing, would you say?
I think it's
I'm curious now because I
yeah,
have not
no,
read this book.
it's undoing its own narrative authority as it moves along, and
Yeah.
everything becomes suspect until by the end with that book you sort of feel, I mean, the kind of like pop culture um analog to this is something like The Usual Suspects. I remember,
Right.
walking out of that movie in 1996 or something with a buddy, and we were driving home, and we were talking about it, and we were trying to figure out how much of what we'd just seen we could actually know, how much
Mm,
can be moved away from verbal Kent's narrative, because so much of it obviously comes from the bulletin board he's looking at as he's talking to Chaz Palminteri's character. Um, and by the end of The Confidence Man, I think the reader has a similar kind of reaction
I like
to
it.
what can you trust, what can you grab a hold of, and why are you grabbing a hold of it?
Right, right. No, I love that. And Moby Dick feels similar to me. I mean, if you think about and spoiler alert if you haven't read it or if you don't remember the end, there's a thing right at the end of Moby Dick, before the epilogue where oh gosh, I wish I had it right at my hands, but I believe Queequeg sort of reaches out of the water and there's a bird there's like
Mhm.
some weird coincidental borderline supernatural stuff that happens right at the end.
Right. Yeah,
And
Tushtigo, like,
Testigo, that's right.
yeah, he hammers the is it an albatross or
I
whatever
think
bird it
so.
is.
Yeah.
He hammers it to the mast.
Right. And I read that and was sort of like, yeah, that didn't happen. I mean, I love
Ah,
the book, but
right,
it's like
right,
that didn't happen. That's just Ishmael. That's Ishmael putting a flourish on this whole thing.
right,
And I'm fine with that. I don't. It doesn't feel. It's to me that's sort of part of the nature of the book. It is sort of its authority is sort of shifting and moving all over the place. I mean, there's even this comes right down to, but this sort of quality of it actually goes into almost the legend of the book for me because if you're reading closely, you realize that the whale isn't actually white in
right,
terms of all white. It's just
right,
more white than most sperm whales are.
right.
So all sperm whales have like little spots of kind of white on their face, and I don't know if it's like I don't know if that's scarring or what that is exactly, but they that's part of what sperm whales have. And this whale actually just happens to be more white, and particularly its head is more white than a typical sperm whale. But then an image, if you see a painting of Moby Dick, that's going to be a completely white, tip nose to tail white whale.
Right.
Um, and even that's kind of like you see how myths build and stories develop over time and kind of get refined. I think that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, Ishmael says that's why he hunts it. He says, the other men hunted it for, commerce or hatred or whatever these reasons. The crew have their own reasons. But he says in the chapter, the whiteness of the whale, like,
Mm.
I hunted it because it was white, because it was
Mm.
denuded of color,
Mhm.
because it's not darkness or blackness that's most terrifying. The most terrifying thing is this strange Arctic whiteness, that is like an
Mhm.
absence of color.
That chapter is amazing. And for people who like, if you haven't read Moby Dick or if it's been a long time, that thing works as a piece of writing standalone, in my opinion. It's great that it's
Absolutely.
in the book, but you can just go read The Whiteness of the Whale and be just gobsmacked.
It's amazing.
It's incredible.
No, it
Yeah.
really is an essay inside the
Hmm.
book about the metaphysics of whiteness.
Hmm.
Just, the color scheme, this color scheme in nature that terrifies Ishmael. And then by the end of that chapter, or like many essay, like you're convinced about, oh yeah, white, a white thing in nature really is this kind of terrifying presence.
Right. And I think, and like all, truly interesting ideas in writing, it seems like it articulates something that we kind of know. Whatever your beliefs are, ghosts are white, right?
Right.
There's
Right.
all, and I don't even remember exactly. He may even mention that in that chapter. But there is a spectral, um, somewhat sinister feeling around white, particularly something that's all white when it's not supposed to be. It's unsettling
Yeah.
for
In
sure.
in the doubloon chapter where Ahab that we're referencing, where Ahab reveals the mission that they're actually on and fires the crew up, he says that all men are as pasteboard masks to him,
Yeah.
and that there's a presence that presses up against that surface. You get the sense of like, I always see in my head the cartoon image from Pink Floyd's The Wall movie, where you have that
Yeah.
screaming face pressing up
Yeah.
against, right?
Yeah.
And Melville Ahab says, if a man strikes, strike through the mask.
Right.
And
And
then he goes, yeah,
that's sort of his rationale for why it's attacking, this whole, you're gonna seek revenge on a dumb brute. And it's like, no, I'm trying to kill the thing through the whale. Whatever that
That's
thing
right.
is, it's a, you know, sure, maybe the whale isn't consciously doing these things in a way, in the way that we might consider a man to be doing them. But if I could kill the whale, it's like I'm gonna jab my harpoon through its eye down into something more metaphysical in it that is anathema to Captain Ahab's existence. And then
Yeah,
it implies that all men are that too, right? All
right.
men are dumb brutes with some lurking thing in them that pushes them along.
Yeah, there's some mystery, obviously, to Moby Dick. And Ahab believes that by killing it, he can get to the core of it and understand it and just grab a hold of some piece of the nebulous universe
Hmm.
that he doesn't have access to unless he does this thing. So it's this large, and that, of course, to Starbuck, makes him insane. It's like, well,
Right.
this is madness. And
Yeah, because Starbuck is just a guy who's he's a guy at work,
he's a
basic,
guy at work.
right? Like you think about it, it's similar if you've ever had like a job where you're working outside. You're like, yeah, we gotta build this brick wall today. Okay, cool, it's cool. We get paid and we'll take a lunch or whatever. And then one guy came along and was like, the wall must go up to God. You'd be
Right,
like,
right.
dude, just hold on, like just.
Well, Starbuck is a good, kind of Quaker Puritan
Mhm.
fisherman, right?
Mhm.
He's like, no, we're here to do a job and make money for ourselves, make money for the corporation,
Mhm.
behind this venture, to make the shareholders money. This is
Mhm.
about commerce, which means it's rational.
Right.
I always think of I love The Dark Knight because of the ideas behind it. And
Mhm.
when Joker creates this new kind of terrorism that isn't rational and isn't about money,
Yeah.
like everyone's against him,
Yes.
right? The
Yeah.
because the other mob guys, like, yeah, they're organized crime, but it's about money. They want something
Hmm.
rational. And what
Right.
Joker wants isn't rational. What Ahab wants isn't rational. However, a lot of critics have pointed out that on the quest to get Moby Dick, Ahab is very careful to stop and hunt the sperm whales that he can
Right.
and load down the Pequod with, spermaceti oil and
Mhm.
et cetera, et cetera. So he
Yeah, so
understands.
it would still be a profitable enterprise.
That's
They're
right.
not coming back empty. Yeah.
But there's something that motivates him beyond this
Yeah.
metaphysical thing that has to do with certainty. It has to do
Hmm.
with trying to master your environment. It has to
Hmm.
do with like bringing up whatever odd, unknowable entity is in the
Yeah.
depths and making it,
Right.
manifest in flesh and blood and oil
Mhm.
and blubber and all that kind of thing.
Yeah. Now this makes me want to ask you get your thoughts on a sort of aspect of symbolism in this book. Um, thinking about what we can take from this as a writer, right? You're gonna read
Mm-hmm.
Moby Dick and you're gonna try to take some ideas or take some tools from it and put them in your toolkit. You know, I I feel like amongst writers there is a uneasiness around symbolism for good reason because
Mm-hmm.
you can when you're trying if you're trying too hard, it gets pretty cringeworthy pretty fast at
Right.
times, right?
Right.
Um, and yet, I mean, Moby Dick, the whale itself, and other aspects of this book, but just even thinking about the whale is clearly, I don't, I can't, I can't imagine somebody being like, yeah, the whale doesn't symbolize anything. It's just a
Mm-hmm.
whale.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't know how you could read this book and come away not thinking that the whale is a representative of something more.
Right.
So, as a writer, like what do you do with this notion that like you shouldn't be trying to do symbolism and yet one of the greatest books of all time is clearly symbolic. Uh, how do we balance that or think about that? How do you think
That's
about it?
that's a great question. I mean, I think about how I talk about this with my graduate students or in my fiction writing classes, and I try to get them to see is the kind of symbolism that we recoil from is where there is a one-to-one correlation between some object or person or character and some idea, whether it's just, oh, well, this is a stand-in for this and this is a stand-in
Mhm.
for that. And that seems preachy, didactic, and easy.
Yeah.
And what I try to steer them toward is the image where
Mhm.
there is this image and it resonates and it becomes representative of various ideas, and but also contains more than you could ever really, to use a whaling term, render down into
Right.
one specific thing. So Moby Dick, the whale in the novel, means different things to different crewmen.
Hmm.
To Starbuck, if we're going to hunt this thing, this needs to be a paying proposition.
Right. Yeah.
It,
It better have a lot of oil if we're
yeah,
hunting this
right.
thing. Yeah.
So yeah, but back to this is a very good point you bring up. I mean, I think we're past allegory. When I feel like I'm watching a movie and I start seeing the pieces align in such a way, I stop feeling as though I'm in an organic story with depth and possibility and the right amount of ambiguity, the right amount of ambiguity.
Right. Right.
And I start feeling like, oh, this is a sermon, this is a lecture, and I recoil from that.
Hmm.
Um, I like it better when writers just allow something to something that is charged with meaning
Hmm.
and very freighted to just be there in the text and resonate. And ultimately, Moby Dick is a whale, and Moby Dick
Right.
bleeds. Moby Dick can be chased. Moby Dick can sink a ship,
Hmm.
right? So, um, I agree. Obviously, Moby Dick becomes representative of ideas, but it's also, I think, character dependent. It's
Mm.
representative to Ahab because Ahab is who he is. It's
Right. Right.
representative to Ishmael because Ishmael is who he is. So I think when we get to, I think the danger zone for fiction writers, storytellers, is for there to be a one-to-one correlation between objects, characters, settings, and
Yeah.
specific ideas, where you're like, oh, this is about late capitalism.
Right.
Where if you want to write a story that draws on themes and ideas about late capitalism or whatever, like you can have all of that, but I don't think you want to be able to pin all of that to the wall, or you just write an essay. So it'd be
Yeah.
perfectly legitimate to write an essay about late capitalism and say,
Right.
well, this is my thesis about X, whatever it happens to
Right.
be.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's really well put. I mean there is an aspect in which I I as I'm reading this because I got thinking about this not in a meta way as I was reading. Not what does the whale mean exactly, but like what does it mean that the whale means something? And
Mm-hmm.
I kind of realized, I think Melville is figuring it out as he writes this, what it means.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not a dismissal of the project, but it's I almost imagine him being out on the whaler, and he did, and Melville did spend his more than his fair share of time on the sea and on a whaler.
Right.
Um, I imagine him, when those first whale hunts happened, and hearing about the Essex, the sort of famous whaling ship from Nantucket that was sunk. And which partially inspired Moby Dick, the novel. I imagine him kind of sitting there thinking, man, it just resonating with him being drawn to write about it, and even he not perhaps coming to some neat conclusion about what it all means. It's
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I'm going to process this sort of feeling I have, this image I have, this moment I have, these
Mm-hmm.
people, and kind of carry it through and almost just present it to the reader so that the reader has to feel and see all of those things too and will come to some similar tacit conclusion that he did. Yeah.
Well, it's a great MacGuffin, right?
Hmm.
The whale is the thing. We believe that the whale is the thing they're chasing. We believe in Ahab's passion about the
Hmm.
whale. We believe he wants it. And his enthusiasm and the mystery about this whale causes us to be like, well, I want to find this thing too. What's
Right.
this encounter going to be like? But you're less interested in the whale itself than in what that confrontation is going to look like, and will that change Ahab, and how is that going to be bound up in the fate of these characters?
Right, right. And well, and it also makes you as a reader kind of start to think like, okay, I'm not hunting whales in my life, but like,
Right.
what has been my have I had a Moby Dick? Maybe I maybe I did have a Moby
Of
Dick and
course.
it sunk my ship, or maybe I did have a Moby Dick and I never went looking for it, you know.
Right.
It does sort of force you to think in those terms. If I was on that ship, what would this whole project mean to me? Would I just jump overboard? Or
Right.
would I be at the front of the harpoon, the harpoon boat going for it? Um, it's
Yeah.
yeah, it's really interesting.
Well, the one thing that an audience can identify with, I'm a broken record about this with my students. Um, your protagonist, especially in a short story, must want and want intensely. Now,
Hmm.
you yourself may not have wanted to hunt down a whale, but you can identify with the desire itself. You can identify with the sense of wanting to get your hands on something that has haunted you and that's mysterious and that always seems out of grasp. And
Hmm.
whatever the MacGuffin is for your character, the most important thing is that the character has this intense, passionate desire for this thing or other character or whatever it happens to be, acquiring X. But what's important is that, people will kill to get X, or that
Right.
this person's life will be a failure unless he lays. I mean, this is what makes the first season of True Detective so mesmerizing.
Hmm.
There's really, it's very, very hard for the Yellow King in the last episode of that first season to be satisfying in the same way as the hunt for him is satisfying.
Right.
Because, kind of like unfurling that mystery and tracking it down. And that anticipation is building and building. And that the quest of that has this devastating, life altering effect on these two men.
Hmm. And it's both destroying them and in Rust Cole's uh for Rust Cole it's keeping him alive actually too at
Right.
the same time, but it also destroys both of them along the way. Or almost destroys both of them along the way. Yeah,
That's right.
yeah. But there it's interesting. It's an interesting reference to bring in because as we were talking, I got thinking about how, Ahab finding the whale, actually getting to the whale. And this is worth thinking about as a writer too. It's sort of like, okay, my character wants something. Well, what does it mean when they get it or when they don't get it, right? Like how are you gonna how do you handle that? And how do you make it in some way satisfying, even if it's not even if that satisfaction is kind of complicated. Um uh but I got thinking, as a reader, you're reading Ahab pursuing this whale, and I start to think like, yes, he is crazy, but also if he does stab through that pasteboard mask into the thing
Mm-hmm.
inside of it, that he will have achieved some kind of transcendence. Like
Mm-hmm.
he will have achieved something. He'll either stab in there into that whale and find out that there's nothing in there, right?
Right.
That his revenge means nothing. He hasn't mastered the forces of nature or anything. None of it actually meant anything. Or he will have in some ways kind of taken on this sort of like dark enlightenment, right? And have seen
Right.
the truth. And in True Detective, at the end or near the end, when Russ Cole gets uh I believe, if I remember how this works, is it right before he gets stabbed, or it's right, I
Hmm.
think, when he comes into the final chapter, and what
Hmm.
distracts him so the Yellow King can stab him is he sees a vision
Hmm.
again
Hmm.
in the darkness of the chamber, right? He
Right.
sees like the cosmos or something,
Hmm.
right?
This
And
swirling funnel of whatever.
yeah, yeah, and that's like he did step into the realm of like what he says in the first episode of the mainlining the secret truth of the universe. Like he
Right.
did achieve that for a second. And I mean, he got stabbed because of it and nearly died, but but but
Yeah.
that was sort of what he was pursuing as much as he was pursuing the Yellow King. So, yeah.
Well, I mean, some people that follow us on Twitter
Mhm.
know that the creator of that show and I are friends. And I can remember when he was writing that, he said that he told me that his favorite novelist, and I believe that he used the phrase warts and all, was Dennis Johnson because
Wow.
he felt that, I mean, this is Nick's words, like he said,
Mhm.
every time he steps on the page, every time he sits down to write a new work, it's the white whale. You have a character trying to get to the dark heart of whatever universe.
Mhm.
I thought that
Mhm.
was very interesting. Less about what it says about Dennis Johnson necessarily. I think there are certainly books of his where that's true for Tree of Smoke, particularly.
Yeah.
But like, I mean, when writers and artists talk about other writers, I mean, they're always talking about themselves,
Oh
right?
yeah,
They're always,
absolutely.
we're always kind of like, tipping our hand in fascinating ways about what drives us, what we think is important.
Mhm.
And oh, I was thinking about what is particularly satisfying to me, and I think what makes the quest for Moby Dick so interesting is we don't from the inside, we don't get like a soliloquy from Ahab after he has stabbed the whale. And of course, he famously gets caught up in like the netting and like
Yeah.
bound up with Moby Dick and is, being dragged to his death and is, I
Right.
mean, this horrible thing. Um, what makes it work is that the reaction to what has happened to Ahab and Ahab accomplishing some part of his quest is that we see it from Ishmael's perspective and we see the
Mm.
horror of this man getting what he wanted and now he's shackled to this beast in the ocean. It's terrifying.
Right. Right. Right.
Um I think if for some reason in some way we had gotten that reaction from Ahab's POV, that would be disappointing because there's kind of nothing Ahab can say that's more powerful than Ishmael watching this complete train wreck. And,
Yeah.
everyone's everyone's killed. People who are innocent are killed. Ahab's killed. The whole thing is horrific. Um, and
Also, yeah,
yeah,
if you saw it happen, if you got into to Ahab's head at that moment, I feel like you wouldn't Melville wouldn't have been able to avoid it being editorial in some way.
right. That's
Like
right.
it ends up kind of closing that loop on what this whole mission actually means based
Yes,
on what Ahab's actual reaction to it is, you know.
that's
Um,
right.
yeah, and that would be, yeah, I think it would, I think you're totally right. I think it would be dissatisfying. And that might be where that's something certainly worth thinking about from a writing craft standpoint in this,
Right.
like, okay, what happens to your character when they get what they want or don't get what they want? They come to the natural conclusion. Not that I don't think the takeaway is that you never reveal it, but
Right.
think about carefully about what you how I think a lot about like this maybe seems like simplistic, but I think a lot about circles versus spirals,
Hmm.
like just kind of keeping some aspect of it open in the end, right?
Right.
Something so it can kind of live on because if it's sort of, to me anyway, if it's too hermetically sealed, it sours somehow in that.
That's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think if you're a writer listening to this and you're working with a story of whatever length and you're in a place where like I'm trying to figure out, I have these characters, I'm trying to figure out who the protagonist is. I, you know, every work of art is organic and requires its own things, but I think a very good answer to that, which isn't ultimately conclusive, but your protagonist is the person who is most changed by the story.
Hmm. Hmm.
And if you make the mistake of having the protagonist be someone else, the reader will immediately be drawn back to this person who is the most conflicted, who makes the largest choice, and who is most altered by the
Mm.
events of the narrative. I was talking to my girlfriend yesterday, and she brought up the Passion of the Christ. And I said, they never should have brought Pontius Pilate on screen. She's like, what do you mean?
Mm.
And I was like, because he steals the story away. And,
Hmm.
she's like, what are you talking about? And I'm like, he makes a choice,
Yeah.
right? And he's conflicted. He doesn't want to hand Jesus over to be crucified. He wants to find another way. And, and then we see his kind of struggle. From his point of view, he's this bureaucrat stationed at a remote outpost. He doesn't want to be there. He wants to
Hmm.
be back in Rome. He's been passed over for promotion, et cetera, et cetera. Well, the Christ story isn't about him making a choice to be crucified. That choice has already been made.
Hmm.
It's been made before Jesus is ever, sent to
Right.
earth, right?
Right.
So Christ as a character is what Ian Forrester would say, is a static character, just meaning he doesn't change, or a
Right.
quote flat character. That's not saying anything about the nature of Christ himself, but
No, this is
just
just the narrative of it. Yeah.
yeah, just speaking about stories, right? But Judas, however, is a round character. Judas
Hmm.
changes. He makes a choice. Pontius Pilate makes a choice and he's conflicted. And I can remember, I didn't see it when it was in movie theaters, but it was streaming and I first saw it. As soon as Pontius Pilate walked on, I'm like, uh-oh, because I was just, my attention was right on him, right? Because
Interesting. Yeah.
because I know what Jesus is going to do. I know the film is not going to depart from the passion narrative.
Hmm.
Um, and I understand people's engagement with with watching the passion. I understand that kind of process, but just as a consumer of stories, like I want to follow that guy. I want the
Yeah.
story to be about him
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
he's conflicted.
No,
He's
that
conf-
makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
right. So back to Moby Dick and back to what writers can take from this in their own stories. Um, Ahab isn't conflicted. Ahab wants something intensely, um, and he is propelling this quest. But it's Ishmael who is changing. It's Ishmael who is conflicted about the things he's taking part in, and it's
Mm.
Ishmael who's processing these things. So Melville found the right protagonist slash narrator.
Yeah, let's talk about the sort of arc of Ishmael a little bit. I mean, one bit of this book that I find fascinating is there's a moment very early on when Ishmael is talking about basically why he's going to sea, and he says he's doing it as substitute for pistol and ball, which basically
Right.
means he's going to shoot himself in the head,
Right.
or go to sea. That's kind of his options, and it's sort of played a little bit with like a wink because Ishmael is
Mm-hmm.
Ishmael is very funny.
Hmm.
People who have never read Moby Dick probably you might not be based on the nature of this conversation we've had right now. It doesn't necessarily sound like the funniest book, but it actually is
Right.
hilarious when it wants to be. Um, but I do think Ishmael, he kind of plays it almost as a joke, this whole pistol and ball thing. But I think that's actually a critical part of the narrative. Like, why is he going to sea? Well, it's not for money, obviously.
That's right.
Yeah, you could maybe make some kind of excuse or some kind of explanation how it's sort of like just for experience, but that's not, for an experience. But that doesn't quite go deep enough, right? Because he could just, I don't know, he could just travel anywhere, travel to a place, and that could be an adventure. There is he is. I almost think he's trying to find his own white whale. Maybe not a revenge story necessarily, but he's like a man without a MacGuffin looking for a MacGuffin, if
And
that
he's
makes sense.
suicidally depressed.
He is. Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
It's a
That's his
real
way out.
problem.
It's like
That's his way out.
yeah, there's meaning out there someplace, maybe, hopefully.
Well,
Yeah, it's
gosh, I
a
mean, like, how many of the people who will listen to this can, gosh, identify with that? I mean,
mhm.
I'm 52 now, so my days of adventuring, um, at least my days of electing to have an adventure are over.
Right.
I might have a few, but they're not. They're not ones I want to go on. But
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, when I was in my early 30s, I can, remember, like, seeking out all kinds of, now it seems like ridiculous
Hmm.
ventures just because of the excitement and because
Yeah.
of the mundanity of life. And Ishmael wants to be part of something.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
I think that's a common thing that humans have. I think
Mhm.
men in particular can identify with that, wanting to be, and whatever it is, but something where there are stakes,
Yeah.
something where there is danger, something where you and your buddies are drawn together.
Yeah.
The
Something
yes, go
where
ahead.
something where there's a story to tell afterward too.
Absolutely, absolutely. Somewhere there's a story to tell.
Yeah.
I'm not a veteran myself, but I'm friends with a number of veterans, and you know what they'll pretty universally tell you is that what they reflect on and what was so um, moving about the experience for them um, was that they were needed. Like, if
Mm-hmm.
you're deployed, on a combat mission in Afghanistan or Iraq or wherever, um, especially as a young man, like, you're going to be needed by the guys around you in a way that you'll probably never be needed again.
Yeah.
If you're a corpsman or, whatever your role is in that particular platoon, you have a job to do. And if you don't do that, that has uh, horrific consequences. And if you do it well, you're back in a very tribal kind of experience where, everyone is pitching into this thing and there are huge rewards and horrific consequences.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, and it does kind of make you think, we're in something of a depression epidemic at the moment, and how many of those cases would be ameliorated if those people felt like they were needed or useful or
Right.
right, that it mattered that they existed. And sometimes people just kind of get themselves stuck in a narrative loop where they're telling themselves they're not even when they are. They can't kind of see what the ways in which they're needed or useful. But nonetheless, like that is definitely, people who have children, and they're in a life or death situation. That's the first thing they think about is that response, and ultimately, it's a responsibility that they're thinking about. It feels like
Right.
love, but it's like, you know, what am I, what's my kid gonna do without me? I can't,
Absolutely.
I can't,
Well,
get. tugged by this whale beneath the surface of the ocean. I've got a child that needs me, you know.
Uh, I've seen people online, excuse me, I've seen people online be annoyed that there's a discussion about male loneliness
Hmm.
and depression among young men. Um, and obviously, young women feel all of those things as well. Um, I guess I would say that in my experience with the people I've known, women seem much better about staying connected with their tribe. And not that there aren't women who get isolated as well. It certainly happens. Certainly experience loneliness, but like young men in particular are uniquely, I believe, vulnerable, especially in the way people live now, where all this interaction is online as opposed to in real life, and getting kind of strung out, disconnected, wondering what purpose they have, wondering, what to do with all this angst. And I think you don't see that as much among women because women are generally better about kind of like staying connected. And men,
Hmm.
the whole taxi driver, Travis Bickle archetype is a real thing that happens to young men.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, Travis Bickle was trying to he in his mind he was trying to become a hero. he
Yes,
he was trying to carry out something heroic and yeah, and and it doesn't look the same from the outside as it does from the inside in that case necessarily, but yeah, yeah.
he makes all these attempts. It's pretty interesting. He makes all these attempts in that film, especially in the first half, to
Hmm.
to connect with people. He tries to
Mm.
do it with I'm blanking, Candace Bergen. Is that who it is?
I
I'm
think
blanking
she's
on her
in that.
name.
Yeah.
But the woman he becomes fascinated with, and he makes an attempt to connect with her, but he's a weirdo, so he takes her to a porn film. He
Right,
doesn't
right.
understand why that's a problem, right? Because he's
Right.
weird. He's a weird guy, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that goes badly, and then his isolation begins to get the better of him, and he reaches out to, I think it's Peter Boyle's character, who they
Hmm.
call the Wizard, and I feel this thing. He can't even put it into words, but it's eating him alive. And so then the whole assassination attempt on the Senate candidate
Right.
um, starts getting ramped up. And then he only does the hero thing because that assassination attempt is foiled by the Secret Service.
Right.
And so he just
That's
goes
right.
on the what Tarantino calls the revenge-o-matic. He just like, oh, I'm gonna kill this pimp played by Harvey Keitel and his and all of his guys, and rescue this girl who doesn't want to be rescued. I mean,
Right.
she's told him this quite frankly.
Right.
Um, so yeah, that thing is real for men. I Ishmael is a 19th century version of that suicidal, lonely, disconnected guy who is struggling for connection and finds something of it on the whaling ship and something of it in Queequeg.
Oh yeah, the friendship with Queequeg is fascinating.
It's
Absolutely.
amazing. It's
Yeah.
amazing. Like, Melville saw that these two guys are opposites. And I mean, but, in the first few chapters after their first night together at the Spouter Inn, Ishmael says, no longer was my hand turned against this wolfish world. The soothing savage had redeemed it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So like he's united with his opposite. These polar opposites are joined together, and he finds community there and
Yeah.
connection.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
then,
and
yeah,
almost like kind of a role model too in a way because Queequeg has a very different way of moving through the world, right? He's uh as much of an outsider as he is, religiously and linguistically and all of that, he's also like extremely competent and kind of heroic.
Yeah, he's
Uh,
badass.
yeah,
Like
yeah, it's
they all
yeah,
are. And
yeah,
those three like chief harpooners, they're
mm,
all from different parts of the world. Like you have
mm.
Tashtigo, right? He's Native
He's a
American.
yeah,
You have Dagu, who I believe is African.
yeah, he's African. Yep, yep.
Yeah, and so you have these three men who aren't white, and they're
Mm.
all highly competent, and they're all badass.
Yeah.
Um,
And
and
they've all like earned the respect of everybody on that ship.
100%.
Right. They don't there's not a whole lot, there's a little bit, but there's not a whole lot of conversation about their race amongst the
No,
crew. It's just
no, it's kind of
Queequeg's a badass. So yeah.
yeah, it's fascinating, and he rescues Ishmael several times.
Yeah.
Um, and
Right.
I mean, and
Right.
Ishmael is quite. I mean, we're back to the first 100 pages or so of Moby Dick, which is very different from the novel it becomes once
Uh-huh.
Ahab steps on stage. But it's a picaresque novel where you have the picaro. Ishmael is going around having humorous adventures,
Right.
right? And
Right.
then there's that great line about he's sleeping with Queequeg at the Spouter Inn, sharing a bed with him, and the innkeeper has to come in and say, "All right, now calm down, Mister Queequeg's a good guy,"
Uh,
and Ishmael says, better to sleep with a sober savage than a drunken Christian,
yeah,
which is
right.
a great thing, right? So
Yeah.
Melville is, kind of like he sees these various things that he can invert. It's like, no, 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 no. Like this is going to be a buddy
Right.
story, and the buddy is, not who we usually think it's going to be in the 1850s.
Yeah, yeah, and I love that aspect of it even in like current context, which you can imagine in 1851 it would certainly raise the eyebrow of some readers for sure. Yeah.
I don't know
And
that there's a corollary before that. I don't know that you have. I mean, the closest thing I can think of, you have to go to Great Britain. Robinson Crusoe and
okay, yeah.
Friday.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the only kind of corollary where you have like this white character paired with someone who isn't,
Mhm.
um, and kind of like exploring that.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and and it's interesting that the sober cannibal and versus drunk Christian thing too. And in my bit of reading on Herman Melville, it does seem that he was very I guess suspicious might be the word, or skeptical about sort of the Christian tradition. I don't know that
Mm-hmm.
he wasn't an atheist or anything, but I think he was very the understanding I get from it is he's very skeptical of sort of the pedestal that Christianity put itself on. Sort of like in terms of like not that any of it isn't necessarily true, but that it has accrued a kind of self-importance that
Mm-hmm.
might be worth taking down a notch. And for one reason is that, yeah, people like Queequeg exist, and he's not, redeemed in the eyes of the Lord, and he seems
Mm-hmm.
like a pretty good guy. So what's that about?
Yeah,
Um,
it's very interesting. And, I
yeah,
think Melville in particularly is suspicious of Northeastern Puritan
yes,
Christianity, right?
yeah,
That particular strain of it. And
yeah,
he's like,
yeah,
he finds it oppressive in the way that a lot of people have found, Puritanism, whether it's metaphorical or literal, to
mhm,
be oppressive and kind of anodyne.
yeah. Well, and I think, I mean, this is, I think, part of what, and maybe you have a better understanding of this than I do, but it strikes me that part of the American Renaissance, which Melville was a part of, along with
Mm-hmm.
Hawthorne, Emerson, that part of it was a response to that anodyne Puritanism, and not a wholesale like getting rid of it. It's not a punk movement or something, right? It's not burn
Right.
the system down, but it's sort of like squirting out the sides of that pressure, like making room larger than that. which is quite interesting. And you can see that. I mean, I'm not as well read on Hawthorne, but you can see that in something like Walt Whitman for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Well, I,
it's
I
like
think
he's
any time in this country, and it may be worldwide, I only feel qualified to speak about America on this particular topic, but anytime like things get too rigid
mhm.
and everything is kind of boxed in, you get something pretty radically interesting art wise, right?
Yeah.
So, in the 50s, where, you have these, cookie cutter homes and the post war dream and the picket fence and all that kind of stuff, you get rock and roll
Hmm.
that kind of grows up as, a way of, getting out of that mold or whatever it is, whatever you want to call what's been happening culturally for the past 10 years, you finally see people breaking out of that and
Yeah.
into whatever. And I think they're going to see some interesting and exciting art. I don't know what it's going to look like, but clearly people have felt hemmed in
Mhm.
by the kind of cultural discourse since circa 2014. And
Yeah.
now it's just kind of like overnight, it seems to have disappeared, which
Yeah.
is really odd the way culture moves. Like people just like wake up and it's just over one day.
Yeah, no, there was yeah, there that definitely has happened in the last couple of months. There's just been a and I just know this because of how much time I spend on Twitter. It's just
Right.
like one day you just log in and you're like, "Oh, it feels different in here for some reason." Yeah,
Yeah. I
it's not
started
quite the same,
I started seeing it just in my students and the kind of
really.
verbiage that, they would use, from about like 2014ish to about 2021. Everything was became, I mean, their talk about things became kind of more jargony, more, you know, sort of cultural, political, very concerned with a kind of like strict enforcement of morality. And then over the past couple of years, as like these kind of younger Gen Z students have kind of come in, they're just different. Their
Mhm.
concerns are just different, and the way they talk is different. Now,
Right.
is that better or worse? Like, I'm not in a position to evaluate that. My my
It's
interest
it's
is that it
hard as a
changes.
person. Yeah, well, it's hard as an older person to look at it and be like, "That's good." I think the natural
That's right.
reaction is to criticize it, but it is good to like hold back and be like, "No, they're going through a similar process that I went through when I was
Yeah,
20." Yeah, it just
yeah,
looks
yeah.
different for them.
I
Yeah.
mean, what I want for them is kind of what I had when I was their age, which was, I mean, in my particular context, it was, there was all this glam metal in the
Mm,
80s.
hmm.
And that was exciting when it was Van Halen and the other 80 in the early
Hmm.
80s. But then by the end of the 80s, there's so many Poison, Warrant, Firehouse, Trickster, Winger
Right.
bands that you can see. And it's just the same thing. And then, these Seattle kids, singing kind of flat came on the scene in, 91. And I mean, I heard Brett Michaels of Poison talk about this. He said,
Yeah.
Nirvana released a video on MTV and overnight we looked ridiculous,
Right.
right?
Right.
I mean,
Right.
that's how culture changes. That's how quickly it can happen. And
Yeah.
then, then we had this explosion in the early 90s of this great music, Nirvana and Pearl Jam and
Mhm.
Soundgarden and Screaming Trees,
Mhm.
Alice in Chains. You can just keep
Yeah.
going, all this great stuff. So what I want for, these young people, I just want them to have, if they can't have health care,
Could you
right?
goddamn give them
Give
something?
them
Yeah, give them some
good
Soundgarden.
movies. Yeah, give them some good music and movies and books. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah, yeah.
I I felt like, the material conditions of my life weren't going to be changed by a politician when I
Right.
was in my early 20s, but I was like, man, have you heard the new Soundgarden?
Yeah. If a really good album dropped, that could
Dude.
change your life, right? Yeah.
Yeah, at least it was fun.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, and that's I mean that's really I love all that because I do I actually think one important thing to carry into reading Moby Dick is to understand that Melville was, I mean, it looks obviously very different, and the sort of philosophical underpinnings of it are different and that kind of thing to an extent. But he was a part of a kind of a movement that America didn't have a literary identity yet, really.
Right.
It had a few people, and it was figuring itself out. So it's easy for us now in the 2024 or whatever, 2025, that you kind of look back in this and it's this old relic, but there is a groundbreaking quality to this. There is in American letters, there is a before Moby Dick and an after Moby Dick. Even though we didn't realize, even though the book didn't get the recognition it deserved until much later,
Right.
with like Raymond Weaver's Mariner and Mystic book, I think is really what kicked
Right.
off the the Melville Renaissance. But yeah,
And
that this
F.R.
was part of a
Leavis.
movement.
You're right. Right. Right.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's something else, right? You can write a masterpiece and it become kind of like a message in a bottle
Hmm.
that,
Tell me
these
about it.
yeah, these future generations can discover this thing and see it in new way. I mean, when I first
Yeah.
read Moby Dick, I was in grad school. I read it for fun. My buddy had read it in a class and he just kept talking about it. And
Mm.
I had thought it was like, is this going to be like just another one of those books that I was supposed to read in high school and then you try
Right.
to read it and it's terrible? Like
Right.
that's what I just assumed it was one of those. And he
Yeah.
just kept saying, man, and there's this part, and then he does this, and then he says this. And I was like, that's badass. And then over the summer, I read it. The first time I read it in 5 days. I
Wow.
couldn't put it down. And
Wow.
this was 97. Uh, my whole thing was, I can't believe how contemporary this feels.
Yes. Yes.
Like all these, I had just taken a seminar in postmodernism, and where we read, these various postmodern novels, and I was seeing. I mean, you referred to this earlier, but
Hmm.
I was seeing all of the kinds of things that we talked about right here in this book about whales.
Yeah, self-reflexivity and sort of broken narrative and side quests and like so many of those things. Yeah.
Yeah, there's an
Yeah.
embedded story. There's a
Mhm.
full-fledged short story called a chapter called the Town Hose Story.
Oh, it's great. That's one
Yeah,
of
it's
my favorite
fantastic.
chapters.
It's
And
great.
and plot wise, when we're thinking about, the Jaws version of this, you can take that chapter out and the book just still works
That's right.
for the most part. But it's fantastic. It's a wonderful read, the
It's
Town Hose
pretty
story.
it's pretty interesting, that connection, though, because the Jaws also has a Town Hose story with Robert Shaw's monologue about the USS Indianapolis.
Yeah, good point. Good
It's
point.
kind of
Yeah.
great, right? Which is
Yeah.
something that they had an idea for, and Spielberg actually called John Milius on the phone
Yeah.
and said, man, Robert Shaw's got to give this monologue, and we
Yeah.
can't kind of figure it out. And apparently, John Milius just sat down with his phone and just started narrating.
Right.
And
So
Spielberg's like
awesome.
writing all this down. And then I think
Yeah.
Shaw took however many pages that Milius had written and then turned it into like one of the most mesmerizing
Oh, it's so good.
moments in that
So
great
good.
film.
Yeah.
It's just like, nothing is happening. They're sitting there. It starts with a joke. They've been laughing, and you
Mm-hmm.
find out. I mean, all of a sudden, like Robert Shaw's character makes sense
Mm-hmm.
in a way that he hasn't before. Like
Mm-hmm.
the threat of this monster is more intimate, and you feel more vulnerable. You're, on this
Mm-hmm.
boat, and that shark's out there circling. It's fantastic.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it's not just the one shark. It's in that case, it's like Robert Shaw really wants to hunt all of the sharks, sort
Yeah.
of. Yeah,
And
yeah.
and that the orca, his boat, like
Hmm.
the Pequod, has all these like shark jaws, and
Yeah.
right. So Melville
Yeah.
Ishmael says that the Pequod is tricked out in the chaste bones of its enemy. I
Yeah.
love that. So like
So good.
the Pequod is like a simulacrum of a
Hmm.
whale, right?
Hmm.
It's like it's got all these whale parts, and
Hmm.
it's a kind of like, jury rigged whale.
Yeah, yeah, and it's yeah, it runs on a certain sense. It runs on whale oil,
Right.
Yeah, both sort of literally and figuratively in terms of that's the whole motivating reason why it's moving. Yeah, yeah, that's pretty interesting. Well, and then actually before they leave land, the Spouter Inn and some of the other locations around it, there's a lot of like things made out of whale bones too, right? Like I
Right.
believe the Spouter Inn, there's parts of the bar that are made out of whale bones and parts of whales. Yeah,
Right.
it's definitely the whales become more than and not just the whale Moby Dick, but all of the whales become more than just animals. I mean, they're kind of like landscapes. They're sort of like resources that you might mine, like gold or
It's
something.
amazing.
Yeah, yeah,
I mean,
yeah. It's
he found a thing. He found the perfect cultural thing that is like alive,
mhm,
like propels an entire industry.
mhm.
There's, commerce built around it. But I mean, I don't necessarily, people have tried to recruit Melville as like being an environmental novelist or something like that.
Mhm.
I don't necessarily, I wouldn't go that far, but there isn't contempt for these things they're hunting from Ishmael.
No.
He has terror and hatred for Moby Dick, but in general, there's this kind of like, I mean, it's kind of sad when they kind of, get various whales. There is this kind of like sadness, and
Yeah,
also just
and
the physical goriness of it.
yeah, the physical goriness of it. And there is like once they've got one killed and sort of strapped to its side, and that's pretty much no, a normal business day for most of the people on the boat because they've done this before, but Ishmael hasn't. There is this sense of like it has demystified the whale somehow. It's one thing
Right.
when it's this sort of shapeless thing out there in the water, and it's another when it's dead hanging from the side of your boat. And it's like, oh, it's just a thing. It's a dead thing like everything else. Yeah,
It's very
that's
interesting.
really
Well,
interesting.
to land this particular episode, or
Yeah,
this segment,
yeah.
what do you think that you've taken from this particular novel that's useful to you in your own writing?
Well, this is a really good question. I mean, uh, the one thing that I like the most of it is, or I think I've taken the most from it is the sort of heterogeneity of it, the
Mhm.
various chapters being about different things, and I think there is a tendency um, in for many writers, but I definitely know that I fall under this where you're trying to make things sort of one tone. Like you start at the
Mhm.
beginning and you go to the end and changes happen. There's plot and things and different characters and stuff, but you're trying to keep the tone all consistent as though,
Mhm.
if you do go on a side quest, you're somehow knocking over this house of cards. And I think the one thing I take from this is like, no, you can actually make it work. Now, will the market bear something that's as heterogeneous
Mhm.
as Moby Dick? I don't know, but I think it does encourage us to at least take some chances in that regard.
Right.
Poke outside of the perimeter a little bit. So that's definitely one thing that I sort of has me contemplating, sort of like what's a not that, I'm going to write a book that has encyclopedic chapters on whales necessarily, but like,
Mhm.
is there a corollary for that? Is there
Mhm.
using different media, not media, but different formats, right?
Right.
Um, because that's one way to achieve that sort of heterogeneous quality. And then, the other thing, and there's a bunch of things that I have sort of highlighted. The register, there's the humor part of it, which I really admire. The fact that it's still funny this much
Mhm.
later, because I think humor doesn't always age very well.
Right.
Um, but there, when you get to a chapter like the whiteness of the whale, he Melville is letting himself rip on those.
Mhm.
Like he is he is not, it's all very carefully done in a certain sense, but like
Hmm.
he is not shying away from this huge concept that he wants to lay out. He's not shying away from like, let me tell you why the whiteness of the whale is, somehow related to the secret dark nature of the universe or something. Like he's allowing himself to go to get into like mind expanding territory. And then he'll bring it back in the next chapter and you're talking about, the goings on the Pequod. Um but that I sort of take courage from that as well. It's like you are, I mean, we're allowed to do whatever the hell we want writing. It doesn't always feel like that, but Moby Dick is sort of like a reminder that, like, yeah, you can every once in a while just step on the gas, just like hit it.
Absolutely. Now I think
Yeah,
about it like a guitar solo, right? Like you have
yeah,
the narrative through line of Moby Dick, and then these cetology chapters. You know, he hits the boost pedal, he stomps on the
yeah,
distortion pedal, and starts
yeah,
to wail, and
yeah.
it's gonna be what it's gonna be. Like
Hmm.
you're in for this or you're not, but you're gonna hear every note that I play because I'm louder than you are.
Right, right. And yeah, and I think that's a good, I mean, there's a certain Melville has a talent and a skill that allows him to get away with that.
Right.
He can back all of that up. So when he is playing that solo, none of the notes are sour.
That's
Um,
right.
so that's definitely something to keep in consideration. But just the allowance of doing that. That's something that I kind of take away from this book and cherish it. Um, yeah, yeah, I think those are kind of the big things. And
Mm,
then also the sort of the potentially infinite depth of very simple tropes in a way.
hmm.
Like we said, the basic thing is, all right, I want to kill the I'm basically Ahab is angry at this whale and he wants to kill it. Now,
Right.
that you can it takes some work and a lot of thought and a lot of bringing a lot of skill and craft to bear, but like that actually ends up, as Moby Dick proves, being an infinitely deep trope.
Hmm.
Um, and it does make you think that like there's probably in your life you're probably surrounded by a lot of things that seem fairly mundane, but if you were to dig into them enough, you would realize they sort of go all the way to the center of things.
That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. For
Yeah.
me, it's always been the language, like
Well, that too. Yeah.
the specific techniques, like his use of alliteration time and time again,
Hmm.
which he sells every time, and the use of that, this wolfish world and that kind of stuff, like
Hmm.
that music sells the overall project that he's working on. Like that's the kind
Yes.
of melody and the harmony that keeps the reader going from sentence to sentence.
Mhm.
And like that passage I started off reading,
So
it's
good.
in it's in iambic pentameter.
Yeah. I didn't notice that, but I believe you. Yes.
Yeah. I don't know if like
Yeah.
every line is, but most of Ahab's speech is iambic pentameter. I
Yeah.
leave a white and turbid wake, right? It's
Right.
which is the human heartbeat.
Hmm.
I began to see like, okay, you can take these literary techniques, and some of these have an actual physical and emotional effect on a reader. Now, the
Yes.
reader doesn't necessarily stop and say, "Oh, that's blank verse, that's iambic pentameter,"
Hmm.
but the
Hmm.
reader feels the effect of that, and he feels buoyed
Hmm.
by all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Iambic pentameter has hypnotic isn't quite the right term for it, but something it's in the neighborhood of it. It has this like effect on you. I think
Mm-hmm.
that probably a well-read passage in iambic pentameter of a different language you'd probably feel that
Mm-hmm.
somehow, even if it wasn't, even if you didn't actually know what it said. I think you would still, it's sort of like, yeah, it creates a oral psychic space, I feel like, when something is an iambic pentameter, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and
He's,
Melville built his style out of the King James Bible
hmm.
and Shakespeare. I mean,
Yeah.
that's what he had to build a style out of, and he built a remarkable style.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. And deliberately too, right?
That's right.
I think there's something that a writer can take away from that too of like, there's this notion, and it's not wrong, but like there is like a, just write the way you talk. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
but there are levels sort of beyond that,
Mm-hmm.
right? Melville didn't talk like this.
No, he certainly didn't.
Yeah, if you were to meet him at a bar in 1860, he didn't talk like Captain Ahab.
Right.
Um, and I think, there's the potential to sort of reach, linguistic or poetic heights, but it requires some deliberation. You have to kind of think about it. How am I piecing this together? What am I basing, what am I basing it on? What's my sort of, do I have rules to it as I'm writing it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think it wouldn't work if, as you're reading it, you were like, "Oh, this is just blank verse," right?
Yeah.
The magic of it is, you read it three or four times, and then someone says, all those monologues are iambic pentameter, and you're like, "Holy
Right.
crap!" Right?
Right.
There's that. So he sells it as organic speech, though it is, heavily stylized.
Mhm.
But just the opening sentences prepare you for that.
Mhm.
Um, it's stylistic achievement.
Yeah. One
Well, yeah, go
one
ahead.
thing I want to ask you, and we can make this a quick answer or a short answer or a
Mm.
long answer. Is this a great American novel? I'm not saying is it a great American novel and why?
I think it is a great American novel. It might be the great American novel
Mhm.
because the other two candidates are built from it. And I'm thinking
Mm,
of Absalom, and Blood Meridian.
mm, mhm.
Blood Meridian is so heavily influenced by Moby Dick that
Yeah.
I don't find it to be a problem. But I had a professor in grad school who said he taught Blood Meridian in a class, and he was a Melville scholar. And he
Mhm.
said Moby Dick is such a presence in this that it's almost distracting for him. That was his
For him.
experience.
Yeah,
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah. I can see that. I mean, I'm not obviously as deep on Melville as this gentleman, but I can see that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so why is it the great American novel? Like it has something to say about the nature of America,
Mhm.
right? It has the right amount of it contains as a vessel the right amount of heft. It has like all of these different diverse group of characters coming together to work toward a common goal. It becomes the Pequod, a microcosm of America itself. I think that's one of the criterion um, that leaps out at me that
Mhm.
novels that have a shot at being the great American novel often create America in microcosm.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Totally. I totally agree with that. Yeah.
And
And I
that's one
think
of the
they,
big things. Yeah.
yeah, and I think they have to. I mean, I think on some level, maybe this is just how I see it. On some level, a great American novel ought to play with, I don't know if it's democracy exactly. Like
Right.
Emerson said he was interested in the infinitude of the private individual.
Hmm. Hmm.
I feel like a great American novel has to do something with that. And I think Moby Dick certainly does, right?
Right.
Just this notion of like, you know, we're a purportedly we're purportedly the first free country, and
Right.
made up of free individuals. And I think a great American novel should probably at least contend with that or
Mhm.
explore that on some level. And
Right.
I think Moby Dick certainly does, right?
What does it mean to be American? What is the American experience?
Hmm.
What are the contradictions, bonuses, and
Hmm.
flaws in this system? And then what is the microcosm, that the vessel that captures that?
Yeah,
All
yeah.
while being a very entertaining read,
Yes.
right? That you don't necessarily think, oh, now I'm sitting down and reading the great American novel. You read
Right.
this captivating story and then reflecting on it, you're like,
Hmm.
oh, this thing, reaches out and touches all of these crucial American totems,
Yeah. I love it. And in this case, mostly taking place elsewhere,
mostly
which
take
is
no.
also,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's a very American thing, though, right?
Uh-huh.
The
Yep.
America abroad, like,
Hmm.
this ship as America sailing through not America and
Yeah. Yeah.
bringing America with you.
It's America wherever it goes. And when Queequeg gets on the boat, he's an American as long as he's on the boat. Yeah.
Well, think about all these old boys that after the Civil War went west,
Hmm.
and went into the territories thinking they were going to get out of America. We're going to escape American law. We're going to
Hmm.
escape, American scarcity. We're going to escape the rules based order
Hmm.
of the East. And then they get to a place like Deadwood and they recognize, well, crap, we got this gold. We're going to need a bank.
Right.
Well, we have the bank. We're going to need like some kind of law enforcement. Well, if we
Right.
have law enforcement, we're going to need a mayor and a comptroller. And they end up, of course, rebuilding the only system that they know, which is American. Like,
Yes,
because
exactly.
America is like inside of us.
Hmm.
It's all we
Hmm.
know. It's all, I mean,
Right.
for
For good or ill. Yeah.
for good or ill, it's what we know. It's what we can reconstruct. And I think there's something that continues to amaze me about it, because this was enshrined by a group of guys in the 1770s and 1780s that were able to see something that could last, and they had no
Mm-hmm.
reason to believe that it would.
Hmm.
But they're like, if this thing has a shot, here's how you go about it.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that.
Yeah, man.
Well, this has been a great conversation, man.
Fantastic.
I really enjoyed this. And man, having a reason to read Moby Dick again. I should say the first time I tried to read it, I read it through, but I kind of just bounced off it. Like
Mm.
it didn't really get its hooks in me. And then I read it again recently, and man, I just turned it. I felt the protons switching on, or the proteins
Right.
switching on in my DNA reading it this time. It was a pretty incredible experience. So I'm glad that I picked it up again for
I
sure.
was exactly the right age for it when I read it. I think I was
Yeah.
25. I was just
Okay.
right in the just it was perfect for me.
Yeah.
To have read at the time, and then I read it again the next year in 3 days. I
Yeah.
was just like, uh, I mean, there was a mesmerizing quality to it, both to
Hmm.
the adventure stuff, to the humor, to
Hmm.
the metaphysical kind of qualities, and just lastly, it's such a weird book, and the
Oh yeah.
weirdness is of such an interesting quality. There's this great scene where every ship they pass, they have these series of gams where the two
Hmm.
ships stop and trade intel, particularly
Yes.
whaling ships. And Ahab, will appear on the deck, next to a ship, and he'll say, "Have you seen the white whale?" And
Yeah.
for a lot of the book, it's the answer's no, but then
Yeah.
he calls out the question, and the captain of the other ship immediately gets into one of the boats and rows over, and the guy steps up on deck, and he's missing an arm
Yes.
that was taken by Moby Dick, right? And
And he
they
was an Englishman, right?
Yes, it's
Yeah.
fantastic, right?
Yep.
And like, without talking, Ahab sticks out his peg leg, and the
Hmm.
guy sticks, I think he has a hook at the end of his arm, and he
Hmm.
sticks out his hooked arm, and they cross them. And Ishmael like renders the symbol on the page,
Yes, that's right. That's right. Yep.
right? And it's so, I mean, it's fantastic. It's occultic and a
Hmm.
really, or esoteric at the very least,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And you feel like, I mean, we're back to the thing, right? You feel like you're mainlining the secret truth of the universe. And
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
so odd and so awesome. And I remember getting to that the first time I read it, getting to that passage and just standing up in my apartment and walking around. I was just like, this is so badass. This is so awesome. What does it mean? You
Awesome.
know,
Right.
all
Right.
the kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, and the next part of this series on Moby Dick, we are going to get into a little bit more of that esoteric stuff. And in fact, I got a lot of a rabbit hole that a different gam led me down. We're going to be
Ah,
talking about that. And a few other things. So, check that out for sure. I think we're going to have a good time.
awesome, man. See you there.
So, welcome to the madness portion of the Method and Madness podcast. So, here we kind of will be going down some rabbit holes you might come across in reading a great work like Moby Dick. And it'll be looking for connections and resonances with history, literature, psychology, whatever really seems interesting. And because I think it's always good to have a direction in mind when setting out on a journey, I've looked for connections, and this won't make up the entire conversation, but I think there's some really interesting stuff here. I'll be looking for connections between Moby Dick and another great American writer who, on the surface, seems as though he might be on the other end of some spectrum we don't quite have a name for, and that's H.P. Lovecraft. So, Aaron, I know you're not a big H.P. Lovecraft guy. Is that correct?
Not because I dislike him.
Right.
I don't think I've read him. I've maybe read a story, but I really do need to dive in at some point.
Yeah, and no, and that's fair. I mean, not everybody can read everything, and I know that you've got a bunch of stuff that you like that I haven't read, and I think that's going to be a cool part of this show. Is I think we're going to get to talk about stuff we individually love, but I think both of us are going to end up sharing stuff with each other that we might not have delved into otherwise. So, um, this, I think you don't need to know a ton about Lovecraft, but I think there's actually some interesting connections here, even though, uh, Herman Melville and Moby Dick is sort of considered like top tier, and it should be top tier Western canon literature. And H.P.
Mhm.
Lovecraft, though his standing, I think, has grown in terms of just overall respect in the sort of literary world. He was writing in pulp magazines called Weird Tales for a pretty small audience for the most part. So, but I think we'll find that there's actually some very common, they have something very common in their writerly DNA. But starting with Moby Dick, and again, thinking about, what kind of stuff you might stumble upon and might make you double click if every word were hyperlinked. Anybody post 2001 who delves into Moby Dick will come across this part that says grand contested election for the presidency of the United States, whaling voyage by one Ishmael, and then bloody battle in Afghanistan. And apparently in the early 2000s, for people who remember that, there was a lot of discussion on various message boards and stuff about the forecasting the future that came out
Mm.
of this, right? Because it is, at that time we had the contested presidential election with Al Gore and George Bush, and then we had battle in Afghanistan. I think I actually don't think that's that big of a deal because pretty much and this is not to glorify it at all. There's been a bloody battle in Afghanistan in most historical periods. So I don't think that that's particularly striking,
Right.
and a lot of elections are contested. I'm not that old, but most of the elections in my adult life have been contested on some level.
Right.
So I don't think that that's that big of a coincidence. But I did find this other thing about this book, Moby
Hmm.
Dick, that's really interesting. Okay, and this comes from I came across this people maybe listen to a show called Formscapes, and Formscapes is goes into some esoteric strangeness. And honestly, I wasn't listening to Formscapes to get anything about Moby Dick, but this just came up, and I was like, oh, I'm actually this was like in the midst of my preparation for this. This came up, but so check this out. Melville, born in 1819, right? August 1st. Now, I'm not an astrology nerd, and I'm not telling people, even trying to make an argument for or against, but I think this is interesting. On his birthday, there was a conjunction, a Saturn Pluto conjunction. Okay. 11 days after his birth, still in this Saturn Pluto thing, on August 12th, the Essex would launch on its fated whale hunt. And for people who don't know,
Hmm.
the Essex is a boat that was sunk by a whale and served as the inspiration in part for Moby Dick, right?
Right.
Um, this is an actual historical event. It was sunk by an 80-foot sperm whale in a what, by all reports, is a very deliberate and repeated attack. It seemed like the whale was trying to sink this whaling ship. Um, Melville ends up sailing to the same region where that sank, right? And he meets the son of a first mate on the Essex, excuse me, who gives Melville a copy of his father's account. Melville gets obsessed, and clearly there's a straight line between that and him writing Moby Dick. In 1851, so Melville's born 1819, 1851, that's when Moby Dick is published. That's the next time that the stars are aligned, Saturn and Pluto conjunction, right? Is
Interesting.
1851. And and then just after the book is complete, still in this Saturn Pluto conjunction, the whale ship Anne Alexander was sunk by a sperm whale. These are the only two whale hunting boats recorded to have been sunk by a whale. There aren't any others. It's not like this is happening every 3 months. It's these two. One
Wow.
that's, one that is a boat that sailed just 11 days after Melville was born, and one that came out just after the book was Moby Dick was published, right? It's just an odd sort of it's hard not to see that and kind of just raise your eyebrow a little bit, I feel like. Um
100%.
yeah. Now if you go into there's this guy named Richard Tarnas who wrote a book called Cosmos and Psyche who talks quite a bit about this. And here's his interpretation of this whole Saturn Pluto conjunction. Again, I don't really know much of anything about astrology, so I'm just taking this from him. Astrology buffs, if you listen to this and this sounds like total BS, let us know. But according to Richard Tarnas, the Saturn Pluto conjunction can be thought of as a deep, abyssal, or chthonic force crashing into and transforming or imploding the rigidly structured. So it
Hmm.
sounds like a whale sinking a boat. Right?
Interesting.
So, for instance, he gives examples such as the Tower of Babel crashing down. There are degrees of intensity to this conjunction, apparently. And the most violent in recorded history of a Saturn Pluto conjunction began October 4th, 1914, just a couple months after World War I was declared. So
Hmm.
I don't know if that means anything or not, but I do think even if you forget the astrology part, the fact that the timing of these whaleboat sinkings syncs up so much with Melville's life and the boat and the book being published, I feel like is interesting, at least.
Hmm.
Yeah. Um, so that's just kind of a little bit, that's one sort of unusual, interesting thing about this book. Um, and Moby Dick is a good book for the thing we're trying to do here because it's a book that I think is kind of about everything. I mean, I
Right.
don't know if you'd agree with that. It's not there's not only something for everyone in here, there's a wide range of sort of styles. I mean, we have stuff that's written like a play. We have, sort of first person picaresque. We have epic adventure. We've got, Shakespearean slash Miltonic dialogue. I guess they're monologues, sort of. Um,
Mm-hmm.
it's got a little bit of everything. There's all this different material here. Um, I got really interested reading it. Um, this sort of narrative motif that he has, especially once Ishmael and once the Pequod sails, of what they call the gams when they
Mm-hmm.
run into another whaleboat, right? And they're always, they're every one of them has some kind of piece of the Moby-Dick puzzle, right? They
Right.
learn something new or they find out some new story from each one, and they're all distinctly different. Um, and there's a one of my favorite ones is the English boat that's basically the Essex
Mm-hmm.
that they run into, right? And the captain of that is missing an arm, and he seems not at all as put out by this as Ahab is about missing his leg. Um,
Interesting.
there's something cool about that, and I think there's something here about the character of Americans versus the English potentially in that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but my favorite one, or maybe the one that's just most interesting to me, is the Gam in chapter 71 when the Pequod meets the Jeroboam. I don't know if you remember this one
Mm-hmm.
specifically. This is the one where we're introduced to the Shaker prophet who has basically taken over the boat.
Mm-hmm.
And he declares that Moby Dick is the Shaker god. Well, Aaron, do you know much about the Shakers?
Not nothing, actually,
Nothing.
nothing.
Okay. All right. It's a pretty interesting story. So we'll get into this a little bit. And I think we're gonna see how this is a little bit of a porthole, I think, into what Melville is saying about America more generally is this Shaker thing. And it's not the whole story, but it's definitely part of the story. And I think knowing what a Shaker is and what it means for America is adds a lot to the book. So let me just quickly read this little bit from chapter 71. Quote, it seemed that the Jeroboam had not long left home when, upon speaking a whale ship, her people were reliably apprised of the existence of Moby Dick and the havoc he had made. Greedily sucking in this intelligence, Gabriel is the Shaker prophet who sort of takes over the boat. Gabriel solemnly warned the captain against attacking the white whale in case the monster should be seen, in his gibbering insanity, pronouncing the white whale to be no less than a being than the Shaker god incarnated. The Shakers receiving the Bible. But when some year or two afterwards Moby Dick was fairly sighted from the mastheads, Macy, the chief mate, burned with ardor to encounter him, and the captain himself being not unwilling to let him have the opportunity, despite all the archangel's denunciations and forewarnings, Macy succeeded in persuading 5 men to man his boat. With them he pushed off, and after much weary pulling and many perilous, unsuccessful onsets, he at last succeeded in getting one iron fast. Meantime, Gabriel, ascending to the main royal masthead, was tossing one arm in frantic gestures and hurling forth prophecies of speedy doom to the sacrilegious assailants of his divinity.
Hmm.
Okay, so the Shakers. These are a millenarian restorationist Christian sect, basically a splinter group from the Quakers.
Okay.
People who don't necessarily know the Quakers, Protestant Christian sect from England, known for their refusal to participate in war, to drink alcohol. They wouldn't swear oaths. They were some of the most prominent people in the abolitionist movement. Richard Nixon was famously a Quaker.
Mm-hmm.
They make really good oatmeal, apparently.
Right.
Um, and one big thing they're sort of typified by unprogrammed religious meetings in which, the priesthood is the lay. There is very little barrier between the priesthood and the laity, and the clergy and the laity, right? Anybody can stand up in a meeting and say, this is what God is saying. Um, Now, the Shakers are like I said, sort of a splinter group of this. They fundamentally share most of the same beliefs, but they tended towards enthusiasm with a capital E. And that wasn't really the Quakers' scene. The Shakers ultimately died out, and there are there are only two Shakers left, apparently. They both live,
Like two people?
two people. They both live in a commune in Maine, Sabbath Day commune in Maine. And they have some help running it as like a museum and a kind of a historical thing, but there's two left. One of them's in her 80s. There's just an article in the New York Times last September about them. It's pretty interesting. Um, so anyway, a little bit more history about the Shakers. 1747, northwest of England. The Shakers, they split off. And by the way, the name Shaker is sort of they're actually the United Society of Believers in Christ's second appearing. They're called Shakers because they're shaking Quakers. They're Quakers that speak in tongues, effectively.
Did they really speak in tongues?
So they did back then. Back when it started, they did. I don't think the like more
Very
contemporary
interesting.
practice they do necessarily, but I think when they started, that was part of their thing. Um, the most influential Shaker was a woman named Anne Lee, or Mother Anne Lee, who was born in England in 1736, never educated, illiterate her whole life. Right, 1758, she joined sort of a precursor to the Shaker sect. And this sect came to believe that she was the second coming. So Anne Lee, second coming of Jesus, right? Uh, so because she was the second coming and she was right there when the Shakers split off, her personality fed directly into sort of Shaker doctrine. She had some major neuroses around sex after and for good reason. I mean, she was forced into marriage by her father, and then she miscarried four times without ever
Oh
having a healthy
gosh.
baby. So you can
Oh,
imagine having some hangups about sex after that, right?
100%.
Um, and so she decided that sex, even inside of a marriage, was a sin. Um, because she had visions of Adam and Eve that suggested to her that sex was the root of all evil. There was very little difference between fornication and sex for procreation. Um, she was arrested a whole bunch of times for proselytizing in England, and eventually she takes her believers to America in 1774. And then in 1780, she opened her testimony in New England. And weirdly enough, the same like day, I don't know if you've ever heard of this historical event, the Dark Day of New England. Have you ever heard of this?
I've never heard of this. What is that?
Yeah. So 1780, and nobody has really explained it. The suggestion is it may have been forest fires, but in 1780, there was a day that from Maine to New Jersey, it was so dark that you had to light candles at noon to see. And then it
Weird.
sort of went away, and nobody really knows what happened. Forest fire is a reasonable explanation, but we don't
Mhm.
actually know. That's a speculation. But what we do know is the sky went dark all across New England. Um, and that happened to be the same day that Anne Lee opened her testimony. Um, Eventually, it became quite the movement. She dies at 48, uh, supposedly singing in tongues as she died, and is buried in Watervliet, which is in the town of Colony, New York, which is just up the road from Albany, where Melville went to school at the Albany Academy, and not far from where Melville would later teach. So my point in sort of talking about this is, to us, the Shakers are a Wikipedia page.
Mhm.
To Melville, the Shakers are those people over there. Right? It's a very,
Interesting.
very different relationship to them, right?
Right.
Um, now, despite the fact she died in 1784, and that's before Melville's birth, but the real peak of Shakerdom came between 1820 and 1860, when Melville was, alive and an adult. Um, and it's a key part of the overall religious kind of freak out that happened in New York in the first half of the 19th century. You have Mormonism being founded in upstate New York around the same time. The popular Millerite cults based around the supposed second coming of Christ in 1844. Subsequently, when the world didn't end in 1844, the thing that historians have called the Great Disappointment, which is this major splitting off of religious groups, and where we get the founding of the Seventh Day Adventists. This all happened in upstate New York Melville's territory. There was also the Oneida Society, who built a utopian compound, the Fox Sisters of Hydesville, who basically kicked off the American spiritualism movement. All of this is happening in the same time in roughly the same place. And people may be familiar with the term that historians apply to this, which is the burned over district. Have
Hmm.
you heard of that? Have you heard of that term before,
I
Aaron?
don't think so. I don't think so.
Yeah, yeah. So I lived in upstate New York for a little while, and yeah, like it wasn't like talked about necessarily, but it wasn't that like you didn't have to go that far to sort of find it. There is still a little spiritualist sort of town in upstate New York that hosts events every year where you can like go to a séance, and they have like it's and the people who live there are all spiritualists sort of living in a, trying to figure out a way to, profit from it a little bit, but apparently, pretty dedicated people to this religion. Um so, Melville is somewhat in touch with all of this. He's at least around for it. It's happening, it's happening within a day's ride of Albany. Um, and all this feeds into what Harold Bloom, friend of the show, calls
Ah,
calls the American religion. Have you ever read his I mean, no, I know you're familiar with Bloom, but have you read The American Religion?
I've read parts of it. I've either
Mhm.
read parts of it or one of my exes read parts of it to me.
Mm.
That's where he says that Pentecostalism and Mormonism are the two American religions.
Yeah, Pentecostal definitely. He's got more. I would say there's more than that. He Mormonism and Pentecostalism are definitely part of it, but also Jehovah's Witness,
Hmm.
Seventh Day Adventists, to a lesser degree the Shakers because they didn't really start in America, but they flowered in America,
Mm-hmm.
and then also basically also Southern Baptists and California New Age. He's the book is pretty smart. I think he takes a few leaps of logic,
Mm-hmm.
but he's kind of showing that there is somewhat of a common DNA to all of these. There's a similarity to all of these. Um, I don't think he's it's definitely worth a read, especially if you're interested at all in sort of the American religious identity. But I think again, I think he does sort of take I think he does take some leaps. I mean, fundamentally, he's saying that all these are Gnostic religions, right?
Mm-hmm.
In one form or another. Um, and I might touch on a couple things he says in here as we go, but the other interesting thing about this whole burned over district phenomena, all these religions flourishing in upstate New York, is it happens fundamentally at the same time and in not quite the same place, but close to the same place as what has been called the American Renaissance in literature. It's happening simultaneously, right? Um, and I don't know, Aaron, you probably know more about the capital A, capital R American Renaissance than I do. Um, but Melville is certainly a part of it, right? This book, Moby Dick, is part of this sort of literary awakening to an American identity in the letters, not just a we're not just Englishmen who happen to be over here writing. We're
Mm-hmm.
Americans writing
Right.
American literature. And up to Melville's time, there wasn't a very strong consciousness of this. Um, I think people probably educated and people probably considered that, say Americans quote unquote needed their own literature, but I don't know that there were that many people working at it consciously. Um,
Right.
and it's really Melville who kind of puts his finger on it. We're going to talk about Hawthorne in a little bit, but he's the one who's kind of like, we need an American literature, and Hawthorne is our sort of forefather. Um, so yeah, we'll get there. Just wanted to put a couple pieces on the table because now what the hell does this have to do with H.P. Lovecraft?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And there's a connection. Now Lovecraft is known as a Providence, Rhode Island guy. He had the words "I am Providence" written on his tombstone. But in fact, the Lovecraft line passes through this burned over district I was talking about. On the Lovecraft side, on his father's side, his forebears landed in Rochester, New York in the early 1830s, in time to be on the scene when Mormonism kicked off in Palmyra, just a few miles away. And 1820, and that was in 1828. when it kicked off. And then American spiritualism kicked off 20 years after that, just a few more miles down the road from Rochester. So his family would have been, his father's line would have been not necessarily participating in any of this. We don't have any evidence that they were, but they were certainly on the scene and they would have been aware of it. And it would have formed part of their cultural understanding of this place that they lived in. Um, I want to make the case that Lovecraft, though he always claimed he never believed in his own mythology that he was coming up with,
Hmm.
I think if you read Lovecraft and understand him as a sort of a new kind of American, or at his time a new kind of American, he was actually also creating something like this same pseudo-Christian Gnostic thing that Harold Bloom talks about as being the Mormons and the Pentecostals. And Lovecraft's just looked a little bit differently.
Do
Um,
you think
and
that's because he's a, kind of a quote genre writer with the, horror and everything?
yeah, I think so. I mean, I think in that case, it allows you to, like I said, he never claimed that he believed in any of this stuff, but, I think he was having sort of visions. I mean, most of the stuff he saw in his dreams that he was coming up with, and it was starkly original at the time, the stuff he was coming up with. I think he was having a sort of visionary thing, and in another time, he may have started a cult, and in his time, he wrote these weird stories instead. I think it's kind of coming from the same place, and he just did something different with it, actually.
Hmm. Hmm.
Again, that doesn't say anything about whether any of it's true or whatever. I mean, people can
Right.
form whatever opinions they want on it, but just where is the material coming from, and what do you do with it? Um, I think Lovecraft just wrote, I almost said science fiction. They're not even science fiction. They're Lovecraft stories. They're kind of their own thing.
Right.
Um, and he was really eccentric. I mean, he was a British loyalist despite being born in 1890 in Providence, Rhode Island, right?
Hmm.
Uh, uh, he wore his grandfather's clothing until they wore out, so he was always kind of harkening back. He was a return bro, he wanted everything, he wanted to turn back the clock for sure. He read the oldest books he could get his hands on. He referred to Rhode Island as the colony of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations, which was what they called the territory before the Revolution. Um, it's an odd guy for sure. Um, he also, for people who are familiar with Lovecraft, I think if you say Moby Dick and Lovecraft in the same sentence, the first thing is, well, they both have Leviathans in there, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Melville's is the Moby Dick, obviously. Um, and we're going to talk a little bit more about what Lovecraft's multiple plural Leviathans were. But I think one thing that's interesting about Lovecraft and why I think he actually ends up being a sort of follow up to Melville in this sense of the American Renaissance and all of that is sort of like Melville, Lovecraft, America was not a young land. It wasn't just brand new, like a lot of people felt like, I think. He didn't really stem the cultural founding of America back to 1776. He stemmed it back to the witchcraft trials of 1692. To him, that's when America started. Um,
Hmm.
and we'll talk a little bit more about this, but for him, and this is a kind of a in reading multiple of his works, it was, that idea, that witchcraft moment, which most of us have been taught to think was simply hysteria and there was nothing else going on and it was all about people accusing each other, or that everybody had been accidentally poisoned by something. Um, Lovecraft, I think, believed that there was perhaps believed or suggested at least that there was actual witchcraft going on then.
Hmm.
Doesn't mean that there weren't innocent people who got caught up in it, but to him, I think there was a core of it that something a little spookier was happening, or at least he liked the idea of it. Um, and it made America as a country a playground for occult forces. This is, I think, how Lovecraft saw America. Um, so let me yeah, so I think no, so kind of moving beyond that, a little bit of sort of Lovecraft, Melville sort of pieces on the stage. Um, there's one thing that Harold Bloom talks about in this. He doesn't really talk about it. It's sort of not quite on the page, but as you read it, you pick this up. And this notion of what is the American religion. And Harold Bloom kind of suggests that we're all sort of part of it, even if we don't say go to a Southern Baptist church.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but there's this idea, and I'm curious what you would think about this, Aaron, just as a American psyche. He's sort of suggesting, and the Shakers, I think their faith suggested this as well, that if you take, the old myths and practices of whatever your sort of ancestral faith are, and you push them through the American psyche, there'll be a sort of enlightenment at the end. Like
Mm-hmm.
we can, it's like, what would be the way to put it? It's like nobody had willpower before America. So we have it now, and somehow we're going to transcend by being here. Um, and I think that's sort of what Manifest Destiny is kind of about too. It's like we're going to somehow transcend these physical limitations that have always hampered humanity up until now. Um, I don't know if people articulated that to themselves exactly, but I think there's a way in which that is at least part of the American identity. And I got thinking
Hmm.
a lot about this. The reason I got thinking a lot about this American stuff is we talked a little bit before about Moby Dick being the great American novel, right? Or a great American novel at the very least. And then you start thinking, as an American, you sort of almost forget about that America word in there a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think somebody from Europe might be like, what do they mean an American? Does that just mean a novel written by America? And it's not. I don't think of the great American novel as just a great book written by an American,
Right.
right? I don't, it's something else. That America word, the more you look at it, the sort of more layers it ends up having to it, I think. Um, so maybe we'll get to even a stronger sense of what that means here. Now, this whole the individualized American psyche taking these ancestral practices. Lovecraft did this a lot. There's this great story called The Dreams in the Witch House, which is basically about this character learning quantum physics and studying folklore and witchcraft at the same time. And eventually he sort of slips out of existence, um, which is pretty good for if that's a good
Interesting.
starting. It's a good starting place for people. It's also interesting to read something that's about quantum physics in like 1920 instead of,
Right.
today, right? I don't know how many people even knew the word quantum physics in 1920, um, or 1930. Um, uh, but there's something interesting specifically that happens in that story that I think ties us thematically back to Moby Dick. And we're going to spend more time on Moby Dick, I promise. At some point in The Dreamer in the Witch House, the character Gilman, he's learned more and more folklore, more and more quantum physics, non-Euclidean geometry, and he begins to be pulled by sidereal forces that he doesn't quite understand. So he'll be walking along and he'll find himself suddenly walking in a specific direction that he didn't set out on. Or he'll find himself drawn to a point in the sky, or he'll find himself drawn to the ground. And it ends up being that there's, some celestial object that is sort of drawing his attention. And depending on where it is in the sky, it draws him in different directions. But it really did get me thinking about Captain Ahab being drawn by this whale to a certain extent,
Mm-hmm.
some force bigger than him pulling him
Right.
along, right? And even though he's more conscious of it, he's still helpless against it, right? The
Right.
revenge has taken him over. You wouldn't say he's in
Mm-hmm.
control of it by any means.
Right.
Um, uh, and I think that's it. I think there's something to Ahab too that, I mean, Ahab is clearly, I don't know anybody who'd even disagree with this. Ahab is clearly one of the most striking figures, characters in all, maybe of all written characters, right? I had a friend ask me, I had a little New Year's party, and a friend asked me, who's your favorite fictional psychopath?
Hmm.
And I don't know if Ahab's exactly my pick because I don't know if he's exactly a psychopath, but he's the
Let's get
first
a
person came to mind.
let's get a clinical definition out there. I
That's a
know
good
that there's some
idea.
people that kind of conflate
Yes.
psychopath and sociopath. The
What does it
way
mean?
that I've come to understand it from a clinical perspective is a sociopath functions fairly normally within a family or a tribe or a gang and can
Mm,
have, pretty quote normal human emotions and has, this kind of connectivity to other people within his group. Um, so like a famous depiction of a psychopath would be like Tony, or I'm sorry, sociopath would be like Tony Soprano,
right.
or I guess Walter White, would
Yeah.
qualify, right? Vic
Yeah.
Mackey from The Shield, Al
Right.
Swearingen from Deadwood. Whereas a
Yeah.
psychopath doesn't have any emotional connection to anyone else at all,
Right.
right? So it's about the pathology is also this pathos, the emotion of, sociopaths, having emotional relationships with people in their in group, and then outside of that, what does Ahab say? All men are as pasteboard masks, which is a kind of indication toward, psychopathy there.
Right. Yeah. 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 And that's the scene that I was sort of thinking of. I mean, take that specific things that he says like that. I mean, you can, I think, maybe make the argument that in his overall mission, like wanting him to go kill this whale and taking crazy chances to do it, that by itself isn't, I don't think, psychopathic necessarily.
No.
But yeah, some of the things that he does or says along the way, I think point in that direction for sure. Yeah. I was just reading a definition that feels a little unsatisfying to me, which
Hmm.
is the meaning of psychopath is a mentally unstable person, especially a person having an egocentric and antisocial personality, marked by a lack of remorse and often criminal tendencies.
So they've
I mean,
rebranded this recently, right? So
I think that's right.
they no longer in the DSM, they no longer diagnose people as being sociopaths or psychopaths. They diagnose them with antisocial personality disorder.
Right. And that's probably more useful. I mean, yeah, you don't need this stigma necessarily, right? I mean, it doesn't do any good. And that the definition I read there, that's way too broad to be indicative of any kind of like therapeutic route or anything. It's just,
Right.
you know, it's an unstable person. Oh, okay, well, there's a lot of those around.
There's a lot of those around. Yeah. Well, I
Yeah.
saw an article the other day about psychopath representations, depictions of
Hmm.
psychopaths, and these clinicians had said that Anton Chigurh from No Country for Old Men um, was one of the best depictions that they had seen of a
Yeah. Now,
psychopath.
yeah, see, it, yeah, I think, I mean, I guess if that's agreed upon that he's a representation of that, I guess I'm happy to accept that. That's not quite the word that comes to mind for me for whatever reason, but
Right.
I mean, I don't know. We're figuring, I guess societally we're still sort of figuring out what these terms mean to us to a certain
Right.
degree. Because I think in the old definition, the psychopath is like literally like a dude with a chainsaw chasing you,
Right.
and
Right. Right.
that doesn't square with Anton Chigurh, right? I mean, he might kill you if he needs to, but he's gonna be pretty. I was gonna say calm. Calm's not the word. He's gonna be pretty in the pocket about it. It's gonna be
He's
very deliberate.
disciplined. He's
Right.
disciplined.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
with,
Yeah.
with
So
the exception of the man that Chigurh kills before the novel opens. He'll later tell Carson Wells about him. He killed a man in a
Mhm.
parking lot because a man called him a name in a
Mm.
diner. And then he says he allowed himself to be taken in handcuffs because he wanted to see if he could extricate himself by an act of will.
Oh yeah,
So
I love
th-
that.
yeah, that's an emotion, right? That's an
Hmm.
emotional reaction, or at least a
Hmm.
passionate reaction. And
Hmm.
then the interaction he has with the the clerk at the gas station, right? He seems to be kind of putting the sights on that guy because that guy personally offends him. But that's
Right.
not where Shigur ends up at the end of the novel.
Right, right, right. So yeah, I think well, I think too this was probably a good example, the Shigur thing and thinking about Ahab and whoever it's I I personally am a little reluctant to throw a label on them because as soon as you sort of try to put them in a box, it kind of stops you from thinking about them too carefully,
That's right.
right? Just like Ahab, if you're like, oh, he's just this psychopath bent on revenge, you can say case closed. And it's like, well, it's actually there's more to it than just that. I mean, he is
Right.
sort of that, I guess, but there's it's not quite the end of it. Um,
Well,
I
Sheriff
mean,
Bell even warns one of his deputies, or I think it's the other sheriff. And
mhm,
the other sheriff says, "Oh, he's just a lunatic." And Bell, and this is in the novel, he says,
right,
"Don't do that. Don't make that mistake. Like he's
yeah,
more than that."
he's more than that,
Yeah,
exactly.
just calling him a lunatic is not going to do anything uh, productive here.
Yeah, well, yeah, and that's true because I think there's a thing, and this happens all the time, man. Like you take it and you say, yeah, he's just a lunatic, he's just crazy or whatever. And some
Right.
people will say, well, that's offensive. I don't really care about that so much as like
Right.
what that allows you to do is you don't have to mentally get in because okay, if somebody out there does something that seems unhinged, violent, or whatever, you can either try and figure out why they did it. Were there actual motivations? Were there quote unquote reasons, even if you don't agree with them? And
Right.
can you think of a route that you might get to a point where you would do that?
Right.
Um, or you can just be like, oh, that dude's crazy. I don't get it. Like
You
that.
don't have to deal with that person anymore, right? The
Right.
moment you're like,
Exactly.
ah, they're crazy, it's like,
Right.
okay, you're basically saying, I refuse to deal with this person.
Right, exactly, exactly. And I think stuff like that happens all the time. We just use that as a technique to kind of shut down actually having to process what that person, you know,
Exactly.
what that person tried to express or needed or whatever it was,
That's
and
right.
not even necessarily in like a, trying to forgive them kind of way, just by understanding what the hell is going on,
Yep.
right? Like, yeah, I mean, we could get into, like the guy who just shot that health insurance uh rep, right?
Right. Right.
Many different opinions on whether that was right or wrong. But if you
Right.
sit there and you go, there's no reason for him to have done that. It's just crazy. Well, like, man, you're
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
missing a whole cultural thing that's
Well, you're
happening
not.
that you're
You're kind of not dealing with it.
right.
I think it's a crazy thing to do,
Hmm.
but
Same.
why
Yeah.
why didn't Mangione think it was a crazy thing to do is the
Right.
more interesting question, right?
Right. Right. Exactly. Exactly. And so doing this stuff kind of shuts that off. Yeah.
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 It would be crazy for you or I to do it,
Yeah.
obviously.
For
I
sure.
mean, I wouldn't do it.
No.
But the question
Me
is
neither.
why did the guy who actually did it do it?
Right, right,
Right.
right. Yeah, and then pretending there is no sort of reason is kind of
Right.
or
Right.
yeah.
There's no
So
good
yeah,
reason. There's no good
right,
reason, but
right,
since when have
right.
people needed good reasons to do what they
Yeah,
do?
exactly, exactly, exactly. Um, Now sort of taking that, and thinking about Ahab and trying to treat him as a multi-dimensional character.
Right.
One of the things I realize is he's not just the sort of a monomaniac, which Melville uses that term a lot, and he is.
Mm-hmm.
He's also uh, he's also a mystic in
Mm-hmm.
his own sort of dark, twisted kind of way. I think we're used to thinking of a mystic as like a guy who meditates on a mountaintop or something like that, and that's not Ahab's kind of mysticism. He's definitely doing something different, and I think this is part of what he's doing is actually a very exaggerated or amplified um, behavior or whatever you want to call it, choice, life path or whatever, that I think is
Mm-hmm.
actually part of the American character. I guess my point is, I think what Ahab is doing is like an intensification of something that's already the American character. And it's part of what makes this an American
Mm-hmm.
novel. And this is the idea that through an act of will, we can as Americans, we can transcend limitations and sort of become God in our own little way. I mean, Harold Bloom argues that that's what Mormonism's actually all about. I don't want to speak for Mormons. I don't totally understand Mormonism enough to have a real opinion about it, but that's what
Hmm.
Harold Bloom would say they were up to.
Hmm.
Um, and you know, we do get that phrase that before we meet Ahab, before he shows up on the page, that he's the ungodly, godlike man, right?
Hmm.
He's sort of the guy who's right in the precipice of this transition into becoming God
Hmm.
somehow.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that's super interesting. And I think that's, like I said, I think that's part of the American identity in some way, is that, you know, we're not gonna,
100%.
you know, I'm gonna, and actually it's funny that Anton Chigurh bit, I'm gonna see, he did it to see if he could escape by an act of will.
Right.
Like, can we just make this thing happen?
Is it
Um,
possible?
right, right. Yeah, it's very interesting.
Which
Um,
is a kind of boredom.
yeah,
It
tell
is.
me more
It's
about that. Yeah.
no, he's bored.
Oh,
He's
Chigurh
bored.
is.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Shigur's
yeah.
bored. Like and then he
Uh,
realizes, well, he tells Carson Wells, he says, but it was a vain thing to do, a foolish thing
mm,
to do.
mhm,
Right. And he's
mhm.
like,
Yeah,
he tells Wells he's moved on from that.
right, right. Do you think Ahab is bored? I mean, he's not bored in the
No,
actions, the events of the novel, but
no,
it's a different motivation.
he's everything in his life and mind is now, this is the monomania. It's geared
Hmm.
toward this whale. So
Right.
he's he's quite interested. And that
Yeah.
monomania is the result of trauma, right?
Sure.
They talk about Ahab right after the injury and burning and
Hmm.
with this kind of fire in his mind.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and there's the one thing that's kind of interesting about him too, because it's yeah, he had to have this sort of traumatic event happen to him. And there are different ways to respond to, you know, people do respond to that sort of thing in very different ways, right? And
Sure.
we see one way of responding to it. But it does also remind me of like um there's this thing that kind of happens. You see this in sort of mobs too, where it's like everybody's sort of like following the rules they're supposed to, and
Hmm.
then one thing breaks, and suddenly some kind of floodgate opens, and suddenly like everything is okay to do. And you'll sort of see this like one thing where I see this is like um when people are too quick to punish somebody, they don't take it out on people who don't quote unquote deserve it, but they're
Right.
a little too excited to carry out the punishment, you know?
Yeah,
It's like
that's
they got this little notch of permission. It's like, oh, now we can do whatever we want. And it's like, yeah, that's as depraved. That's pretty
yeah.
depraved too.
I've been a gun owner and a hunter all my life.
Mhm.
And I have friends who own guns and hunt, but there's that certain kind of friend who it's not enough to have, the guns, shoot the guns and everything. They're like, I hope someone breaks into my house, I'll give
Right.
them, I'll do this and I'll do that. And I think people have the right to defend themselves, but that would not be something I would look forward to. And I don't
Right.
think most of those folks are thinking about how absolutely that experience would turn your life upside down, even if it was just.
Right. Oh yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah, it gets weird when you somehow transition from yes, I want to be able to defend myself to like
Of course.
fantasizing about it. It's
Yeah.
strange. It's that's a weird. I mean, maybe that's a bit of boredom.
And also I just don't, a lot of those guys just haven't thought it through very carefully.
Hmm. Hmm.
They don't
Hmm.
understand, like, oh, this is going to change everything in your life. Even if you're in the right, even if you're defending
Oh
yourself
yeah.
and your family, it's still going to change your life.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, I don't see any way. I don't see any way around that. You know, it's
No.
like, yeah, yeah.
My grandfather said, this is, as an aside, but
That's all right.
I asked him about it, and he's, you know, veteran of the 82nd Airborne Korea era. And I asked him, would you shoot someone if they broke in? And he said, yes.
Hmm.
And he understands that it would be an upheaval, but he said, the choice between allowing someone to hurt my family and taking someone's life, he said, I've already made that choice. And I thought that was a pretty
Right.
thoughtful,
Yeah.
it's a pretty
Yeah.
thoughtful look at that.
Yeah. I mean, I think that is probably the decision most reasonable people do come to, but it doesn't mean you'd be happy
No,
about,
no, no,
or
no.
take any, it's just kind of, yeah.
It'd
Yeah.
be very consequential.
Yeah. I'm glad I've never had to be faced with that
Good
up
grief,
till
man.
now.
Me
Right.
too.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, One thing I got, thinking about Ahab a little more, one thing I got really interested in on this read of it is, obviously Ahab, he's kind of charismatic. He's got this monomaniacal thing, right? Fascinating character. But as I've been reading it, and I got to thinking, like, man, Ahab almost has, I don't know what exactly to call it. I guess you could just say it's charisma, but he has, and we were talking a little bit about Nosferatu before this. He
Mhm.
has this, he develops this psychic hold on
Right.
the other sailors, right? I mean, he compels them with material incentives. He has the doubloon, and in part, some of these guys are just kind of go along for the ride. Some of them are adventure seeking anyway, but there's something beyond that, right? We have Starbuck at one point says, quote, my soul is more than matched, and he's talking about by Ahab. She's
Hmm.
overmanned, and by a madman, insufferable
Amazing.
sting that sanity should ground arms on such a field, but he drilled deep down and blasted my reason out of me. um
Incredible.
right,
Mining
and then
terminology.
yeah, yeah. And does suggest that like something's happening more than just some words that are being said or more than just this
Right.
incentive. There's something actually in Starbucks head happening. Um and then even Ishmael says, I, Ishmael, was one of that crew. My shouts had gone up with the rest. My oath had been welded with theirs. And stronger I shouted, and more did I hammer and clinch my oath because of the dread in my soul. A wild, mystical, sympathetical feeling was in me. Ahab's quenchless feud seemed mine. With greedy ears, I learned of the history of that murderous monster against whom I and all the others had taken our oaths of violence and revenge. And, you know, Ishmael, up until the point he's on the Pequod, he does have sort of suicidal depression and stuff, but at least
Hmm.
in his how he describes events unfolding, he's kind of he seems like he doesn't seem like a guy who leans into violence and revenge very easily to me,
No, no,
right? He's a pretty chill. He's actually kind of a chill guy in a lot of ways,
absolutely.
right? And humorous and yeah, yeah. And so for him to get sort of ensorcelled into this, I think is really interesting and suggestive of how uh, of this whatever this dark psychic charisma that Captain
Hmm.
Ahab has. I mean, I think he's actually a kind of like if I put him, you could take him and put him in, say, a Lovecraft story, and he
Hmm.
would be like a black magician or a wizard or something like that, but fundamentally could be the same guy doing the same sorts of things. Um,
Interesting.
and in fact, this is our next connection to Lovecraft because there is a Lovecraft novel, and this is not the one that most people read. It's not the one that people even suggest most of the time. Most of the time, when people are talking about Lovecraft, they're talking about Call of Cthulhu or something like that. But Lovecraft wrote a novel called The Case of Charles Dexter Ward. And I think if there's a lineage of great sort of these Miltonic, Ahabian, Kurtzian, Judge Holdenian. Is that the right? I don't know if that's the
Yeah,
right way to
right.
say that. But right, I think we can all of us who've sort of read or are at least familiar with these works, I think we can see this common lineage between these characters, right? There's similarities at least, or different articulations of similar themes and concerns. I think Lovecraft's character Joseph Kerwin is could fit right into this, and this is a character that shows up in this novel, The Case of Charles Dexter Ward. And let me just tell you really quick about Joseph Kerwin.
Hmm.
Uh, he's this old witch from the 17th century America, right? He narrowly escaped the purges in Salem. Again, that 1692 is the real founding of America in Lovecraft's universe, right? And then he establishes a shipping empire until he starts to draw attention for not aging. At some point, he's like 70 years old and he looks like he's 25, and people start to scratch their heads and ask him some hard questions. And it turns out he's been importing these very strange things from all over the world, and he's been marshaling corpses to do his nefarious bidding in the middle of the night. And ultimately, you find out as the reader that he's a mass murderer whose ultimate goal is magical immortality. He wants to live forever, forever.
Hmm.
Um, and he has the power to summon ancient gods, lowercase g, to help him. And sometimes he can't always control them. This whole thing leads to him being quote unquote killed at the hands of locals in the year 1771 in the case of Charles Dexter Ward. In this event in the book, the people who kill him, the people who kill Joseph Corwin, are men like Abraham Whipple, Moses Brown, and Ezek Hopkins. And for people who are real Revolutionary War nerds, they will know that those are real men who were important in the execution of the Revolutionary War. In Lovecraft's book, they show up, but the first thing they do is they try to kill this Joseph Kerwin guy, and this happens before the Revolution. Um,
Wow.
Right. So there's this cool thing where Lovecraft is sort of like he's playing with the origins of the nation itself, right? It's a little bit of it's historical revisionism. Obviously, there was no
Hmm.
Joseph Kerwin, but
Hmm.
he's 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 letting it bump up against actual historical events enough that it kind of wedges its way into his idea of what America is. Um, the magical working he's doing continues up until after his quote unquote death, until the year 1928, in which it possesses his direct descendant, Charles Dexter Ward, and basically tricks Charles Dexter Ward into resurrecting Joseph Kerwin and his coven through the use of these quote magical salts or whatever. Um, and then Joseph Kerwin is now alive. He's been brought back from death and has at least temporarily achieved magical immortality. But I think as I'm reading, and I'm kind of reading this book next to Moby Dick or one after the other, right? And
Hmm.
I keep seeing Joseph Kerwin as Ahab in this American sense of if you sort of exert your will enough, you can transcend physical limitations and get to something like godhood, right? It's sort of what Captain Ahab was sort of trying to kill God. I think that's probably a simplistic way of putting it, but that's sort of my bullet point idea of what he's trying to do. And Kerwin's trying to kill death. Um, and yeah, I don't know. I sort of see these two things kind of playing with each other. Now, again, Lovecraft's doing this in a pulp magazine in the 1930s. But nonetheless, I think they're both saying a similar thing about the American character. Um, there's yeah, do I want to read that? Do I want to read that? Yeah, let me just read this real quick thing from the
Hmm.
case of Charles Dexter Ward. And if people haven't read it, and especially if you're sort of interested in like historical, it's not even quite historical fiction. Like clearly it's revisionist, obviously. But if you're interested in it, I would definitely take a look at it. It's also partly written in an epistolary format. The perspective shifts around a lot. Like the sort of protagonist in the early part of the book, who the protagonist is switches midway through the book in a kind of an interesting way. It plays a lot with really cool dramatic irony stuff. Like you feel like you know what's going on and you don't, and sometimes you know stuff that's going on that the characters don't. It's pretty well done. Um, and it doesn't suffer as much from the kind of tendencies that people often criticize in Lovecraft. Like a lot of people will criticize, oh, he spends all this time telling us how scary this monster is, but not describing it. It doesn't really fall into that. It's much more sort of rollicking and sort of straight ahead. One thing kind of leads to the next. Um, and at this point, I'm just going to read this little bit just to get a flavor of it. Um, at this point, Charles Dexter Ward basically how Charles Dexter Ward in 1928 gets convinced to resurrect his great great grandfather is he's subtly becomes obsessed with his own lineage through a curse. I know how ridiculous this sounds when I describe it. But this curse makes him obsessed with his own lineage. So he's like, I have to figure out who my great grandfather was, and starts to uncover all this stuff and becomes obsessed with dark magic. I'll just read this a little bit. Quote, he stated that the papers of his ancestor had contained some remarkable secrets of early scientific knowledge, for the most part in cipher, of an apparent scope comparable only to the discoveries of Friar Bacon and perhaps surpassing even those. They were, however, meaningless except when correlated with a body of learning now wholly obsolete, so that their immediate presentation to a world equipped only with modern science would rob them of all impressiveness and dramatic significance.
Mm.
So, uh, so yeah, so I think there's a connection there between Moby Dick and Lovecraft in terms of they're to some degree understanding the American character as executed by an individual, but also their I think there's some overlap. We sort of talked about that religious aspect. They're passing through of the burned district, at least in their family line. They're they have different, but I think overlapping perspectives on this sort of uh, second layer of what America is, right?
Mhm.
We can have there's a sort of idea of America that's sort of like what you learn in grade school, right? And then as you grow up, you learn it's much more complicated
Right.
and interesting, frankly, than that. And part of it, it depends on what you personally think is important, but
Mhm.
um, I don't know if you know about this. I did get reading about the whaling industry generally, and I don't have like a bunch of stuff prepared on this, but do you know that Nantucket was essentially neutral during the Revolutionary War,
Interesting.
right? And they basically, I mean, whaling was a really important industry to like
Mhm.
the early America, very important. Second only to like, the sort of meta category of agriculture was whaling. Um, but yeah, Nantucket was apparently neutral, and that was very uneasy for both sides because it was always like, are they actually neutral, right?
Mhm.
But then apparently the first trade vessel that went from America to England after the Revolutionary War was carrying whale oil. Like that was the first time we're like, okay, we'll trade with England was actually whale oil. So that's this whole whaling thing is like in the very basic, in the sort of creation story of the United States of America is whales and whaling and whale oil, um, which again adds to this idea of the book Moby Dick as a great, capital A American novel. Um,
It's fascinating.
yeah, one other kind of thing I wanted to just mention in terms of this Moby Dick Lovecraft correspondence is Nathaniel Hawthorne. I have to admit, I have read very little Nathaniel Hawthorne. I don't know about you, Aaron. Is that something you've gone deep on?
Just short stories.
Okay. Okay. I think I read the Scarlet Letter, when I had to, and
Hmm.
I liked it, but for whatever reason, I never really gravitated toward it. Um, Melville, are you familiar with what Melville thought of Hawthorne?
He loved him.
Right,
He
right. Yeah,
absolutely loved him.
yeah. He called him like essentially the American Shakespeare was sort of his perspective on it.
Yeah, he was
Um,
so when they met, Hawthorne had published a very favorable review of one
Redburn,
of
maybe?
Melville's early novels.
Might
I
have been
forget which
Typee.
might have been.
Yeah.
And uh, Melville, greatly respected Hawthorne, and couldn't believe that this guy that he thought so much of had praised his novel.
hmm hmm And they did end up meeting prior to the publication of Moby Dick, and there's a lot of sort of speculation, but there is some thought that the conversation he had with Hawthorne, which apparently took place over a few days,
Mm-hmm.
actually may have changed the course of the book Moby Dick, because
Interesting.
up to then, the stuff Melville had written would had been he'd pretty much hewed to autobiography, right? I mean, not that
Mm-hmm.
everything that happened in those books is a fact, but he pretty much was recounting in a very artful and accomplished manner, recounting what had happened to him. And luckily, or I guess maybe luck isn't the word, he'd had some adventures, so there was something to write about, right?
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't the modern day auto fiction of like, I
Right.
don't know. I'm a barista and my girlfriend dumped me. It was like it was like I lived with cannibals. It was
Yeah, right,
actually
right.
like intense stuff. And people who don't know, I mean, Melville, he hopped off the whaling boat. He was on a whaling boat. He basically jumped off the whaling boat in the Marquesas, and which everybody was terrified of because they believed that there were cannibals around. He marched through the jungle jungle he'd never been in, and eventually he was arrested in the Marquesas, I believe, and then escaped. Like he had a crazy adventure on the high seas.
Right.
Um, and then wrote about it, right? And if you got a life like that, you don't necessarily need to make anything up.
No kidding.
um, right? So I think the kind of the thinking is that after Melville met Hawthorne, and Hawthorne was older, and Hawthorne was, probably the most accomplished writer of his day,
Oh, for
or
sure.
the most well known. That really changed courses. That I think nudged Melville into making Moby Dick, well, the very special and unusual book that it is. Um, but let me read. So there's a great review, and I do recommend you can just find this because it's so old. Uh, Hawthorne wrote a book called Mosses from an Old Manse, and Melville wrote an incredible review of this called Hawthorne and His Mosses, which um, I think is like, you know, you think about this American Renaissance thing we were talking about, right? This pre-Civil War, the literary figures in America figuring out what the hell they were doing, right? Figuring out what does it mean, what is this, what is this place we found ourselves in? What should we be trying to do creatively? Really kind of waking up, sort of. And again, I sort of said I think that there's some commonality between that and this flourishing of unique American religions at the same time. I think they're different uh different directions of a similar process. Um
Right.
but read for anybody who's interested in this historical period in terms of literature, definitely go read Hawthorne and His Mosses. It's super interesting. I want to read just a little part of it so you could get a sense of what he thought of Hawthorne and what he thought was going on. Um, Quote, but it is the least part of genius that attracts admiration. Where Hawthorne is known, he seems to be deemed a pleasant writer with a pleasant style, a sequestered, harmless man from whom any deep and weighty thing would hardly be anticipated, a man who means no meanings. But there is no man in whom humor and love, like mountain peaks, soar to such a rapt height as to receive the irradiations of the upper skies. There is no man in whom humor and love are developed in that high form called genius. No such man can exist without possessing, as the indispensable complement of these, a great deep intellect, which drops down into the universe like a plummet.
Hmm.
Let me read another little part. Quote, for spite of all the Indian summer sunlight on the hither side of Hawthorne's soul, the other side, like the dark half of the physical sphere, is shrouded in a blackness, 10 times black. But this darkness but gives more effect to the ever-moving dawn that forever advances through it and circumnavigates his world. Whether Hawthorne has simply availed himself of this mystical blackness as a means to the wondrous effects he makes it to produce in his lights and shades, or whether there really lurks in him, perhaps unknown to himself, a touch of puritanic gloom, this I cannot altogether tell.
Wow.
Um, a little bit further on, just one more little bit. Now, it is that blackness in Hawthorne of which I have spoken that so fixes and fascinates me. It may be, nevertheless, that it is too largely developed in him. Perhaps he does not give us a ray of his light for every shade of his dark. But however this may be, this blackness it is that furnishes the infinite obscure of his background, that background against which Shakespeare plays his grandest conceits, the things that have made for Shakespeare his loftiest but most circumscribed renown as the profoundest of thinkers. And then he goes on to basically say Hawthorne is our Shakespeare, right? Um, and again, I'm not super well read on Hawthorne, so I don't have strong opinions on the writing of Hawthorne. I'm kind of just going on what Melville is saying here, but clearly Melville's looking up to him in a major way, and I think sort of seeing it as, those bits I read, Melville could be talking about himself in those, in my
Right.
opinion.
Right.
This darkness being there and all that. I think maybe he is sort of secretly talking about himself. Maybe he's not even conscious of the fact that he's talking about himself. Um, but I want to kind of paint in one final connection to Lovecraft with this. Um, Now, in addition to all of the stories that Lovecraft wrote, he also wrote a like 70 page ish, I guess you'd call it a essay or a review, perhaps, called Supernatural Horror in Literature. And
Hmm.
it's a fairly early attempt at trying to really understand uh, this sort of set of tropes and traditions in literature, stretching back, to the Gothic era and up to his contemporary time. He's, when he writes it, he's writing about some living writers as well. And for anybody who's, curious about the title of that, are you curious about supernatural horror in literature? It's a really good place to start, and it'll give you, dozens of potential things to read that you may not have heard of. But I wanted to read just one few sentences out of this, thinking about Hawthorne, because what Lovecraft's doing in this essay, he's essentially he is like Melville and like, well, I guess more like F.O. Matheson, who wrote the book that kind of coined the term the American Renaissance, who's sort of, sometimes you have to like look back to actually identify what happened, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You're like, I always think about this now, like we're living in this moment, and I think for a lot of people, it sometimes feels like nothing's really happening. But like 20 years from now, you look back at now and be like, that was kind of crazy, right? It'll seem crazy then too, I'm sure.
Ah,
I don't think things are calming down. But,
no.
I think you can't really it's hard to put names to things and understand the limits of things when they're actually happening. So anyway, point is, just like, somebody a little bit later had to come and kind of nail down and be like, that was the American Renaissance. Lovecraft is doing this and simultaneously establishing kind of almost like a category. It already exists, but he's sort of he's sort of writing making a circle around it, which effectively becomes weird fiction, capital W fiction. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and to him, Hawthorne is hugely important for this genre. He says, quote, "Another school, the tradition of moral values, gentle restraint, and mild, leisurely fantasy tinged more or less with the whimsical, was represented by another famous, misunderstood, and lonely figure in American letters, the shy and sensitive Nathaniel Hawthorne, scion of antique Salem, and I don't know if you knew this, Nathaniel Hawthorne, great grandson of one of the bloodiest of the old witchcraft judges. Nathaniel Hawthorne's
Right.
great grandfather was a Salem witchcraft judge who sentenced people to death."
Right. This is something Thomas Pynchon has
Mhm.
considerable fun with.
Yes, that's right. That's right. So, I think it's interesting that both, talking about how do we find these connections, but thinking about how do we connect these two. Melville, Hawthorne is the Shakespearean genius of American letters, right?
Right.
Lovecraft, Hawthorne is fundamental to this other completely different literary tradition that he's participating in. And it makes me honestly, it's like I think, man, I really should be reading Hawthorne.
That's
I need to be more
fantastic.
familiar with this stuff.
Well,
Um,
to land our segment,
mhm, mhm.
where would you recommend our readers starting with Lovecraft?
With Lovecraft, I think the first thing you want to read is Call of Cthulhu if you haven't.
Okay.
It's a pretty expertly written little thing, and it's Lovecraft breaks a lot of he breaks a lot of the conventions that we think of as good writing in terms of his characters are often not three-dimensional, to be honest with you. A lot of times they're kind of thought experiments, but played
Hmm.
out. Call of Cthulhu is great. It reads in some ways like a really good piece of history, like if you were to
Mm.
read a history book, but about this supernatural entity called Cthulhu and the various cults that have popped up around him. At the Mountains of Madness is really good. It's basically about these Antarctic explorers, and again, written in a time when we knew very little about Antarctica. Now, you just go on Google Earth and you scroll around, you're like, I don't see any monsters. What are you talking about? In 1920, we
Wow.
didn't know that. We didn't know a lot about Antarctica.
Right.
So people were coming up with stuff. And their guess was as good as anybody's. But that's
Amazing.
about these explorers basically uncovering an ancient society. Well, it's the remains of an ancient society in Antarctica. Um, and then going mad, as the title implies. And then the case of Charles Dexter Ward, that book that I referred to, which, I think, you can make a list of great American novels, and Moby Dick goes right at the top. But there's a list of, what would be the right word? There's a list of like alternative or
Hmm.
weird or something else
Right.
great American novels. And I think Case of Charles Dexter Ward is pretty close to the top of that list for sure.
That's fantastic. Well,
Yeah.
guys, stick around because in the next segment, we have the great Ben Avery of the Lemon Party podcast to talk about Moby Dick,
Woo woo.
and we will see you in a few.
Yeah, yeah. Mad Method Pod for everything.
Is that a pretty good?
Yeah.